Chapter 776, Preparations without the high tea session. Klein decided to pray at St. Samuel Cathedral, so as to show his devoutness. Of course, he didn't forget to stop and admire the white pigeons on the square, allowing himself to appear leisurely and calm. He entered the cathedral, passing through the murals that were illuminated by the sun from high above and arriving at a dark and deep prayer hall. This place wasn't as gorgeously decorated like the other churches that had all kinds of dazzling elegant taste that produced a visual impact. Instead, it was mild and peaceful, allowing one to feel a natural sense of tranquility. As for the pure light that resembled twinkling stars up ahead, they were filled with the intense solemnity of holiness. Klein removed his hat and handed it to Richardson along with his cane. Then, he walked down the aisle. At this moment, two figures stood up in the front pew and turned towards the entrance. One of them was the black-haired, green-eyed Leonard Mitchell, who looked suave with his untidy hair. Almost at the same moment, Leonard Mitchell also saw the middle-aged man with the white sideburns and deep blue eyes. Dwayne Dantes. He tensed up momentarily as his body showed signs of indiscernible stiffness. Klein gave Leonard a side look as he nodded with a smile. He had a friendly and casual expression. Leonard forced a smile as he nodded in a slightly sluggish manner. Following that, he turned to the side, made way, and brushed shoulders with Dwayne Dantes. This made Klein see who the person was behind him. It was also someone he knew, Daly, who was wearing a spirit medium's black robe. This lady still wore blue eyeshadow and blush, presenting quite an uncanny sense of beauty. Daly glanced at the middle-aged gentleman when her expression suddenly went adrift. She retracted her gaze as she silently approached the exit. "No way, I was just mimicking Captain's profound eyes. Even the color is different, yet Ma'am Daly could still find it familiar. A woman's intuition is truly terrifying." Klein had a vague guess when he noticed Daly's brief abnormality. A long time ago, as an insensitive man, he believed that Ma'am Daly was secretly in love with Captain, otherwise, she wouldn't have endured the risk to rush to Tingen to get Klein to find an opportunity to teach the acting method to Dunn Smith. As for Captain, Klein wasn't sure about his thoughts. After all, Dunn Smith, at that moment, was often unable to distinguish reality from a dream. His bad memory was rather pronounced, and he might unknowingly have forgotten certain things that lay at the bottom of his heart. However, Captain often mentions Ma'am Daly, using her as an example to educate us. He was so familiar with how many years she took to advance and the kind of talent she had that it seemed like he had memorized it. Yes, whenever Captain mentioned these matters, he would occasionally add that he spent 9 years going from midnight poet to nightmare. Could it be that he was feeling a little inferior when facing Ma'am Daly? Inferior. Klein recalled the past as his mood suddenly felt dampened. He realized that he didn't really understand Dunn Smith. He didn't understand how many things the man had hidden inwardly. And Ma'am Daly isn't much younger than him. She appears to be very open and doesn't care about marriage. Klein silently sighed and reined in his thoughts. He found a nearby pew and bowed his head, closing his eyes to pray. Outside the prayer hall, Leonard had recovered as he gathered with the other Red Gloves teammates with Daly. They waited for a while as Soest, who had become a spirit warlock, walked out from another side. He scanned them and said, "Our mission this time is to use the various clues discovered from the explosion of the Black Skeleton Gang's headquarters to find all the formal members of the numinous episcopate in Backlund. Ma'am Daly is a beyonder from the corpse collector pathway. She knows quite a bit about the numinous episcopate, so His Grace, St. Anthony, has gotten her to assist us." In the evening, Klein, who had dismissed Richardson, took 4 steps counterclockwise and entered above the gray fog. He conjured the world Gehrman Sparrow and made his blurry figure pray. "Please inform Miss Magician that she needs to reserve a hotel room before Friday night. It's best that it's far from the place where Mr. X holds the gathering. Pass me the stone and spell book ahead of time. I need to make certain preparations. On Friday night, she needs to stop her friend who participates in Mr. X's gathering and also present to me that person's external appearance when in disguise. If there's anything else, I'll inform her in time." With only 2 days left before the assassination attempt on Mr. X, Klein undoubtedly needed to prepare ahead of time. And there were many things that needed preparation. Dwayne Dantes wasn't able to do everything, so he had to rely on Miss Magician. His preliminary plan was to use the powers of a faceless to disguise himself as a participant in Mr. X's gathering. He would enter directly with the passcode, and then he would employ different plans based on the situation. According to the experience he had in engaging in combat and controlling his marionette, Klein had a feeling that a marionettist's principle was, try to hide behind the scenes, covertly directing a script. Unless necessary, a marionettist had to avoid engaging in direct combat with others. Currently, the most troublesome point is that Mr. X's gathering is at 8. And usually, at this time, Dwayne Dantes clearly wouldn't have fallen asleep. He won't be able to escape the notice of his butler and servants and secretly head to Eastborough. Of course, on the contrary, it can also create an alibi, but the problem is, what method should I use to fool everyone in his house? If only I had a faceless partner who can act as Dwayne Dantes. Miss Justice's necklace can do it, but she's not in Backlund. Klein leaned back into his chair as he rubbed his temples. He had even considered directly summoning and responding to himself, using his identity as Hero Bandit Black Emperor to carry out the operation, but doing so would cause him to lose the ability to change his physical appearance. It also made it difficult for him to possess others and disguise as Furz's friend to participate in the gathering. Unless Miss Magician's friend is a part of this, allowing me to possess him or her. That wouldn't do either. First, it will expose some of the Tarot Club's secrets, and second, Mr. X might have the means to discover a wraith. Of course, traces of this can be concealed using a series of seals with a gold coin, the paper angel, or the iron cigar case. Klein considered for a while before deciding on a method he was very proficient in from his previous life. Feigning sickness. I'll begin acting sick tomorrow. I'll eat very little, and sleep before 8. This way, the butler and servants wouldn't disturb me. But if there's an emergency, what do I do when Walter and company knock on the door? A magician's illusion creation can only fool the eyes. It isn't some artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence. Right, I can fix the illusion onto a mirror, letting it look like Dwayne Dantes. Then, I'll get a Rhodes to answer remotely. With this in mind, Klein's thoughts suddenly opened up. I have to say that a Rhodes can be quite useful at times. After a poignant comment, Klein returned to the real world. He walked to the desk, took out pen and paper, and began drawing a picture comprising of symbols that implied secrecy and mystery prying. Just as he finished his final stroke, the room's lighting dimmed suddenly. The full-body mirror first turned deep black before silver light surfaced. Loanese text appeared one after another. Great Master, your loyal and humble servant, a Rhodes, heard your summoning. Was I late? There's something new every time. Klein shook his head in amusement. No. How tolerant you are of me, Great Master. You can ask your question. Words neatly appeared on the mirror. Klein thought for a moment before saying, I plan on eliminating the Aurora Order Oracle, Mr. X. Do you have any suggestions? The full-body mirror's words froze for a few seconds before changing. It's best you do it after Thursday. It's in line with my divination. Angel of Fate Ouroboros or a saint of the Aurora Order might be around Mr. X tonight and on Thursday. Klein smiled and said, A Rhodes, I have something that requires your help. This is my honor. You are giving me an opportunity. Words quickly emerged, fully professing what it meant to be excited and delighted. May I ask what the mission is? Klein nodded and said, This Friday night, I will be using a mirror as an illusion prop, changing it to look like my present identity. If any emergencies happen, you're in charge of controlling the mirror to answer without letting anyone discover any abnormalities. Can you do it? The air around the full-body mirror suddenly gushed around, and a toady voice belonging to Dwayne Dantes sounded, Great Master, I'll try my best to complete anything you command. Although it won't be able to last long, and it doesn't match my usual habits, it's enough to deal with everyone here. If you wish, I can simulate any voice. You're more talented than I expected. It's not easy being a mirror these days. However, why does that final statement sound odd? Klein's facial muscles trembled as he said, when dealing with them, hide the nature of the question and answer game. Don't let others notice it. Rhodes immediately presented a new sentence on the full-body mirror. I will play your identity well. Very good. Klein nodded. He was truly worried that Rhodes would begin asking butler Walter and valet Richardson embarrassing questions. Questions like, have you fantasized about ladies you shouldn't have any urges for? Or, who do you think of late at night when resolving your physical needs? He believed that with the magic mirror's way of doing things, it might very well carry out such an act without any forewarning. Back then, Danitz nearly broke down thanks to its questions. Without speaking any further, Klein switched to saying, that will be all for today. I'll contact you again on Friday night. Yes, great master. Your humble servant already looks forward to serving you. Rhodes first conjured a single line before producing a drawing of a hand waving. Chapter 777, Sick and Crazy Setup. On Friday afternoon, Klein, who had skipped a literary salon because of his feigned sickness, arrived above the gray fog once again. In front of him was a hard-covered, palm-sized notebook which was bronze green in color. It was Lamino's Travels which the magician Furs had provided. After flipping the item which was closer to a spellbook over to a certain page, Klein looked at the yellowish-brown page, raised his hand, and summoned the sea god scepter from the junk pile. As he injected some of his spirituality into Lamino's Travels, making it light up with a faint luster, he made the blue gem on the scepter's tip emit a bright light. A sizzling sound was produced as bolts of silver lightning appeared out of thin air. They were thick and menacing as they zapped about, meshing together to form a hurricane. At the same time, complicated symbols and labels quickly outlined themselves on the page of Lamino's Travels. They overlapped each other and fused together, slowly taking shape. Just as the page was about to be colored in silver, bolts of lightning snaked out from it, causing all the patterns to be destroyed. It failed again. Klein sighed silently as he repeated the same process. This wasn't his first attempt. Ever since he obtained Lamino's Travels on Wednesday night, he would head above the gray fog from time to time, using this spellbook to record the powers produced by the sea god scepter. He repeated it until his spirituality was nearly drained, forcing him to return to the real world to take a break. During this process, there were successes and failures. Klein relied on repeated attempts before completing the final step, recording the lightning storm spell which he had eyed for a very long time. This was a demigod power of the sailor pathway. Before that failure, Klein had failed nearly 20 times. It could be said that his luck was terrible. After repeated failures, he was delighted to see a silver luster spread across the yellowish page at the 5th attempt. An ancient, mysterious, complicated, and indescribable symbol contracted, forming a fancy diagram that made anyone who placed their eyes on it feel as though they were being struck by lightning. Phew. I've finally succeeded. Klein rubbed his fingers against the paper and heaved a long sigh of relief. He flipped through Lamino's Travels and admired his previous efforts. Over the past 2 days, he wasn't fully caught up with Lightning Storm. He also recorded 2 other demigod powers. One of them was Paper Angel that he had used while stirring some of the powers above the gray fog. It aided in disrupting any divination and prophecies. Similarly, there was Hurricane that stemmed from the sea god scepter. When recording them, Klein was rather lucky. One took 9 times, while the other took 12 before he succeeded. As for Flight, Glide, Lightning Strike, and other powers that didn't reach sequence 4, they only required him to do it once or twice. Therefore, Klein had almost filled the entire book. This spellbook isn't very useful to unaffiliated Beyonders. It needs plenty of time and patience to record a sufficient number of powers. And when the powers exceed sequence 6, the chances of failure increases, making the powers difficult to obtain. However, there are 22 pathways in the mystical domain. If the first few sequences have their powers matched well, finishing off a sequence 5 isn't too surprising. Klein closed Laymanos Travels and sighed inwardly. From his point of view, the spellbook was equivalent to half a divine artifact for unaffiliated Beyonders. Although it was more difficult to be useful than Creeping Hunger in its early stages, once there was a good combination, it was quite normal for one to fight someone of a higher sequence. However, among Beyonders who were supported by major factions, Laymanos Travels would be ridiculously powerful. This was because it could record a demigod's powers. As long as they wish, a demigod can repeat the power again and again. As for Creeping Hunger, it has a high chance of failing to devour a demigod. Even a real shepherd would find it extremely difficult to graze a high-sequence Beyonder. Firstly, there are no available resources, and secondly, it's easy to lose control. Elder Lovia from the City of Silver was someone lucky enough to be able to graze a sequence 4 evil spirit. When Klein thought of this, he cast his gaze onto a dark green, coarse stone. It was rough and uneven with signs of burn marks. It was none other than Furz's stone that allowed the traversal of the spirit world. With Laymanos Travels and this stone, along with the Luck Siphon Charm and Wraith Marionette, even if Mr. X has a saint protecting him, I should still be able to complete the mission and leave without problems. Klein rubbed his temples and returned to the real world. After setting up a bestowment ritual, he brought the corresponding items back. After making all the preparations, he walked to the full-body mirror and looked at himself. He made himself look haggard. After dinner, Klein had used the excuse of not being well to return to his room. After taking in the night scenery, he took out a palm-sized mirror from the drawer and placed it on the soft and elastic pillow. Then, Klein went over, making the mirror reflect the blue-eyed, white-sideburned Dwayne Dantes. He then slowly straightened his body and took a step back, creating another Dwayne Dantes in bed. This gentleman was wearing silk pajamas and leaning against a pillow. He held a book in hand with his eyes half closed as though he was in thought. Not bad, the mirror illusion isn't weaker than a paper figurine illusion. Klein returned to the desk and picked up a fountain pen, drawing the strange symbol that was a mixture of secrecy and mystery prying. After a brief silence, the Dwayne Dantes in bed suddenly opened his eyes and gave a toady smile. Great Master, your loyal and humble servant, Rhodes, is here. I have to say that even with Dwayne Dantes's face, there's no way he can look normal with that kind of smile. Klein silently sighed and nearly turned to look to his side. Very good, he praised with a nod. He didn't give any other instructions. With a half-top hat, he slid down from the balcony to the first floor. He followed the secluded garden trail and flipped over the corner perimeter wall of 160 Buckland Street. During this process, he hadn't forgotten to close the windows. Pressing his right hand on his hat and landing his feet on the streets, Klein slowly looked up. At some point in time, his facial features and outline had changed. He had black hair and brown eyes, with a thin and angular face. This was the crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow, who had a bounty of 50,000 pounds from just a single country. The hunt was about to begin. Sherwood Beyonder. Zio, who was just about to head out to East Borough to participate in Mr. X's Beyonder gathering, was stopped by Furs. You want to head out to gather material? Zio deliberated before saying the words her friend often used. Furs stroked her hair and said, no, to earn money. I previously accepted a mission to find the dust left behind after a ghost fades away. As you know, there aren't any ghosts at the cemetery. They've all been given a send-off by the priests and bishops to their respective deities' kingdom. Therefore, I can only head over to East Borough and find targets that died due to various reasons without being discovered. Can you bear letting such a beautiful and frail lady like me head into such a messy place alone? But, can't you push it back a day? Zio said hesitantly. I'm planning to participate in Mr. X's gathering. Furs immediately shook her head. No, I need to complete the mission tomorrow. It's a total of 50 pounds. If it's due tomorrow, why didn't you do it the past few days? Zio looked suspiciously at her friend. Furs chuckled. Is this your first day knowing me? Don't you know I have a severe case of procrastination? Besides, you have no money. What's the point of going to Mr. X's gathering? You don't even know what Beyonder ingredients you need. That's true. Xiao was convinced before she smiled. Does every author have a sickness of procrastination? Probably. As Furs perfunctorily replied, she secretly heaved a sigh of relief. In the East Borough, inside a cheap motel, Klein entered the room which Miss Magician had reserved for him under a fake alias. Here, having a room and a bed for one person was an extravagance, but even so, such rooms only cost 12 pence a night. Of course, many of the cheap motels in East Borough didn't have any single rooms. The best of them were some compartments that cost 5 pence a night. It only had a bed and a partition that blocked others from looking inside, allowing the occupants to change clothes. As for the 10 to 20 bunk beds in the basement, they cost 1.5 pence a night. The motel didn't hold any responsibilities for the items that one stored there. There's actually a mirror. Not bad. Klein put down his hat and stood in front of a full-body mirror filled with crevices. He then wore the hooded robe which Miss Magician had prepared for him. Immediately after that, his body shrank at a discernible pace. His skin gradually turned pale with a tinge of malt colors. The Adam's apple at his throat vanished as his hair grew long and turned blonde. Klein instantly recognized the image of Furs's friend, even though the disguise didn't show her looks. It was Miss Xiao. However, because there was a hood to conceal himself, he didn't really transform into a woman. All he did was handle the easily noticeable spots. I can't do anything about the height of 150 centimeters. I'll need to digest the entirety of my potion before I can reach this limit. Thankfully, Miss Xiao disguises herself by raising her height. I don't have to vex over this. Klein looked at the 160-centimeter tall figure in the mirror, switched to a pair of leather boots that looked to be and was flat-soled. After donning the disguise, Klein hooded himself and silently left the single room from the window. He came to an alley in East Borough, taking a detour until he arrived outside the building where Mr. X was hosting the Beyonder gathering. After recalling the passcode which Miss Magician had provided, Klein rapped the door with his fingers, 3 light taps and 3 heavy taps, separated by 2 long and 3 short intervals. After 10 seconds, the door silently opened. An attendant wearing an iron mask first observed the visitor before making way. Klein calmly walked past him and entered the building without showing any signs of panic. Chapter 778, 1 + 1 greater than 2. While passing through the living room, Klein's spiritual perception was triggered. He felt that there was an invisible gaze scanning him from an unknown location. He feigned ignorance as he entered the activity room ahead. He surveyed the area and found a spot that wasn't too far or close to the host's seat. And at the moment he passed through the activity room's door, all the attention on him vanished. If not for the wraith having 3 seals to isolate it, it probably would have been noticed. Mr. X doesn't appear to be as bold and crazy as he seems. Klein sat down and moved his hood, hiding his face deeper in the shadows. After about 10 minutes, when most of the members had arrived, a brass mask-wearing Mr. X appeared by the door without causing a commotion. He walked in and headed towards his seat. He was dressed in a black classical robe with a pointed mage hat. As he walked, he had a converged aura, but it was enough to make everyone present bow their heads without realizing it. Turning around and slowly taking his seat, Mr. X surveyed the room and said in a deep voice, "Let's begin." He's within 4 meters. Klein wasn't in a rush to take action. He retracted his gaze and patiently watched as a few gathering members exchanged information about people with abnormal luck for money. Occasionally, Mr. X would reply. Time ticked by as the gathering's focus went from Mr. X's act of handing out rewards to the transactions between the members. Klein didn't hesitate as he tapped his left thumb on the first segment of his index finger twice, activating his spirit body thread's vision. Illusory black threads immediately surfaced before his eyes as they emanated from the bodies of different people, out into the void toward some boundless distance. After making a simple distinction of the threads, Klein began to secretly control Mr. X's spirit body threads. There were two difficulties to this mission according to his plan. The first was that having astrologer as one of the earlier jobs in his pathway, Mr. X, or the other hidden Aurora Order saint might be able to sense the danger when he began controlling the spirit-body threads, acutely sensing some abnormality. Klein wasn't sure about Mr. X's spiritual intuition because back when Miss Sharon existed in a wraith state, she failed to notice Marionettist Rosego's controlling of her spirit-body threads. However, for a saint who was a demigod, a high-sequence beyonder who had obtained godhood, no special trait of this being would surprise Klein. It wasn't surprising if that being's spiritual intuition was triggered due to the changes in another person's spirit-body threads. For other Marionettists, they were probably helpless regarding this. But Klein was different. He had another identity as the Fool. He had the powers of the mysterious space above the gray fog to aid him, allowing him to rely on paper angels to produce interference and eliminate any hidden problems. The gathering continued without any abnormalities. More than 10 seconds passed as Klein was close to gaining initial control of Mr. X. There was only 3 seconds left, but this Aurora Order oracle didn't notice at all. He continued observing the completion of another transaction with a deep look in his eyes, his thoughts a mystery. At the critical moment, Klein stopped. He barely maintained his progress as he extended his hand, reaching into the pocket of the hooded robe and touching the iron cigar case which had been sealed with a wall of spirituality. Klein moved his fingers, prodding it gently to remove the wall of spirituality, allowing it to disperse into a swirling wind inside his pocket. He pulled back his palm and waited for a few more seconds until Mr. X's gaze looked to the side before he continued controlling the spirit-body threads. 2 seconds. 1 second. 0. Mr. X's thoughts turned sluggish as though someone had poured stirred cement onto him. An enemy. Danger. Slow thoughts appeared in his head as he quickly made his decision. He planned on seeking help from his subordinates and the entity who was watching in secret, and put up an effective resistance. At this moment, coldness drilled into his body, preventing his limbs and mouth from answering his will. Admiral of Blood Seigneur. A wraith's possession. There were many flaws to a marionettist's control of spirit-body threads. The biggest problem was the target immediately realizing that there was a problem once initial control was attained. They would then have the ability to carry out any contingencies. If it was one-on-one, without anyone around them, Klein could naturally use the target's increasingly impeded state to effectively disrupt and interfere with any resistance they put up, but if the target had any aids, it was very difficult for a marionettist's control to fool others. It required help from the environment, or partners to conceal the matter without exposing it. And on this point, a wraith who was able to possess a target and forcefully control them was the best support for a marionettist. The reason why Klein didn't directly enter a state of initial control was because he needed to release the wraith. After the initial inspection at the door, the vigilance in the activity room at the gathering location was definitely lower. Mr. X's eyes widened as his thoughts turned sluggish. His instinctive attempt to shout was blocked by his throat and mouth, silencing him completely. His attempt to raise his hands also slowed down as they reached for a porcelain teacup by his side. This completely violated his will. It was because of the cold aura that occupied every corner of his body. Wraith. Marionettist. No. If this continues, I'll die silently. Mr. X immediately controlled his spirituality as he constructed complicated symbols and labels in his mind. He was just about to open a traveler's door, which was also the door of teleportation, to escape the marionettist's control range. Compared to that, a wraith's possession was relatively less dangerous. But amidst his sluggish thoughts, the illusory symbols and labels failed to appear all at once. Instead, they appeared one stroke after another in a discontinuous manner and at an insufficient speed. Seizing this opportunity, Wraith Seigneur, who was possessing Mr. X, under marionettist Klein's control, simply moved Mr. X's head, changing his seating position. Such an action instantly interrupted the formation of the traveler's door. Oh no. My reaction is too slow. It will be interfered by the wraith. Use mystical item. Mr. X's eyes filled with blood, but none of his subordinates around him noticed it. Even the one watching in secret didn't notice any abnormalities. As for the gathering members who were interacting and trading, they lowered their voices because of his change in seating posture. At that moment, the activity room was filled with people. Although there were Beyonders everywhere and many were his assistants, Mr. X found himself in extreme solitude and was helpless. He didn't even know who was attacking him or where the attacker was sitting. As the thoughts went through his mind, Mr. X regained control of his spirituality as he directed it towards the golden ring with an embedded ruby on his left index finger. However, going from a thought to a decision, and then going from a decision to an action took too long. It was as though he was acting out his thought processes in slow motion. This gave Senor plenty of time to raise Mr. X's left palm, bend his finger, and tap the side of his forehead which was uncovered by the brass mask as though in thought. It was a very faint tapping sound, and the strength used was quite significant, but under Klein's control, Senor held back perfectly. It made most of the strength enter Mr. X's mind without spreading outward so as to hide any commotion. Tack. Tack. Mr. X's thoughts of emanating his spirituality were disrupted, and he was temporarily unable to find his train of thought. By the time he recovered, the marionettist's control had deepened. This made his thoughts chaotic and impeded. Even his thinking and decision-making became extremely difficult. With the Wraith using all kinds of tiny, concealed actions to interfere with Mr. X's attempts to use his various Beyonder powers and impressive mystical items, he slowly slid towards the abyss of becoming a marionette. He watched helplessly as he marched towards death slowly. Only then did he realize how terrifying and unsolvable the combination of a marionettist and Wraith was. The hunt continued silently under everyone's noses. As Klein's control deepened, Mr. X's actions turned stiffer and sluggish. However, with the Wraith possessing him, no one could notice any problems. To be precise, Mr. X's actions were no longer a result of the sluggish him, but from Wraith Senor. He wasn't even able to show the look of despair in his eyes. Amidst the transactions that either succeeded or failed, ranging from arguments to negotiations, 5 minutes quickly passed. Klein was just one last step from killing Mr. X and turning him into his marionette. However, he couldn't do so. This was because he had yet to digest much of the marionettist potion. He could only control one marionette at present, so if he wanted to convert Mr. X, he had to give up Wraith Senor. But once he gave up Senor, this Admiral of Blood who was long dead would immediately surface and be discovered by everyone. It would bring about extreme trouble. Similarly, if Klein didn't give up his Wraith marionette and assassinated Mr. X while he wasn't able to resist, he needed to consider the Aurora Order Saint who was lurking in the shadows. This was the second most difficult part of his plan. To silently control Mr. X and remove his ability to resist wasn't difficult with the combination of marionettist and Wraith. The way to kill him wasn't difficult as well. Mr. X in his present state could easily be finished off by Klein with an air bullet. The difficulty was in leaving safely after pulling off such a stunt. This actually required sufficient patience. Time slowly passed with Klein appearing calm despite his tense nerves. He pretended that he wasn't interested in the items that appeared as he kept silent the entire time. Finally, when the gathering came to an end, Mr. X said in a deep voice with complete normality, "The end." His words were succinct, just like the way he ended the previous gathering. This was what Zio described to Furs. As the gathering's members stood up one by one, Klein mixed in among them, looking inconspicuous. At the same time, he reached his hand into his pocket, and he flipped open Lamino's travels based on his sense of touch. Chapter 779, One-shot. The 3 types of paper in Lamino's travels clearly had different textures. The white paper that could only record sequence 7, 8, and 9 powers was thin, smooth and flat. The yellowish-brown goatskin which could record sequence 5 and 6 powers were very pliable like tanned leather. The 3 charred yellow pages that could record godhood powers were thick and textured. Together, they allowed someone to quickly distinguish between them simply from touch. Klein's fingers quickly found the thick and textured 3 pages as he gently pinched the middle page. Although his pocket wasn't large enough, preventing him from fully opening Lamino's travels, the hooded robe was personally modified by Furs herself. The pocket had plenty of space, allowing the palm-sized spellbook to be flipped to a right angle. As Klein used his palm to prevent Lamino's travels from closing, he used his finger to slide across the corresponding page's surface. The surface had slight bumps and depressions, making the strange patterns and symbols that were filled with mystery and ancient vibes be directly presented in his mind. He injected his spirituality into it. This charred yellow page recorded a demigod power of the storm pathway, hurricane. Klein wanted to use it to create chaos, so as to interfere with the Aurora Order saint who was lurking in the darkness. By doing so, he could seize the opportunity to assassinate Mr. X and escape with the help of the wind. Aside from this goal, the chaos could also effectively hide his tracks. By letting the members of the gathering scatter, and with everyone's identity being a mystery, doing so made everyone be a suspect. The Aurora Order would then find it difficult to pinpoint Zio. As his thoughts whirred, Klein locked his gaze onto a spot, and he slowly pulled out Lamino's travels. Meanwhile, Mr. X took 2 steps to Klein's side, standing near him like he was a friend he hadn't seen in years. Following that, there was a loud buzz as a terrifying hurricane spiraled out of control in front of everybody. It was where Klein had targeted his spirituality at. The tables, coffee tables, sofa, and high-backed chairs in the room flew up as the violent hurricane ripped through the walls, carrying the roof away as it headed for the alley. Some of the gathering's participants were in the way of the hurricane and were thrown far away, while others fell forward due to the wind pressure as they ran in another direction. If Klein hadn't purposely controlled the timing and direction of the hurricane, not only would Mr. X's old house be destroyed, but even the series of condominiums around it would suffer damage. As for the gathering participants, they would have been swept up in the hurricane, having their survival depend solely on luck. The buzzing sounds quickly intensified as the hurricane that reached into the sky was like a terrifying giant. It stomped across the alley towards the street, leaving nothing behind in its wake. Klein was similarly swept up as he and the possessed Mr. X were thrown onto another street. During this process, as both of them were standing close to one another, along with how a wraith could float, these could control the target's body to a certain extent even with the hurricane. Therefore, the distance between Klein and Mr. X ultimately stayed within 5 meters. His control of the spirit body threads had never been terminated. In midair, with the howling winds in his ear, Klein suddenly yanked at his chest with his right hand, tearing away the hooded robe's surface, reached under his arm, and drew death knell. Although in Mr. X's current state where just air bullets alone could finish him off, Klein decided to be cautious. He was afraid that certain mystical items on his body would suddenly be triggered, just like Admiral of Blood Seigneur's necklace. When hunting, it was necessary to do his best. Klein's vigorous action of drawing his revolver had obviously affected his control of the spirit body threads. If it wasn't because Mr. X was on the brink of being fully controlled, just this alone was enough to recover his usual lucidness. However, even so, Mr. X's thoughts were no longer impeded as his mind sped up. He attempted to resist, but with Wraith Seigneurs possessing him, it had forced his efforts to be in vain for a brief moment. Then, Mr. X's eyes reflected an enemy who swooped downward. It was a thin face with pronounced facial lines. In his vision, the person coldly cocked the revolver, pointing the black barrel at him. Bang! Klein didn't hesitate to pull the trigger as the gunshot was drowned by the howling winds. Mr. X's head jerked backwards as though an invisible hand had pressed onto it. His head and brass mask shattered into pieces, splattering red and white liquids everywhere. It was a lethal shot. Death knell had sounded the knell for him. Plop! After the shot, Klein fell to the ground on his back. With a thud, Mr. X landed beside him as the blood and fragments that scattered in midair had strangely flowed back, gathering by his neck and forming a head filled with cracks and crevices. This was the ability of a wraith. At that moment, the hurricane was starting to disperse, and the huge commotion had undoubtedly caught the notice of faraway demigods. Inside the Holy Wind Cathedral, the new Backlund Archbishop, deep blue officiant Randall Valentinus, instantly flew out of his room as he floated in the air. Klein, who had fallen on the ground, noticed that the wind pressure had weakened. With Death Knell in one hand and Laymanos Travels in the other, he flipped the latter to the first yellowish-brown goatskin page. After obtaining this spellbook, he realized that there were a few pages recorded in it, with one of them being Traveler's Door. Klein originally imagined that it was a coincidence, but on careful thought, he found it inevitable. This was because Laymanos Travels belonged to the ancient Abraham family. They wielded the apprentice pathway and several corresponding mystical items, so they had the resources to easily record a traveler's powers. After all, this was something very, very useful. At that moment, as long as the Traveler's Door was formed, Klein could leave unharmed with Mr. X's corpse that was being possessed by Wraith Seigneur. He hadn't used it in the building, because it was possible that the Aurora Order Saint might intercept it. Furthermore, Mr. X was also a traveler. He had a chance of successfully escaping via Traveler's Door. Therefore, Klein didn't dare risk it before he was completely dead. At that moment, Klein's vision went black as he realized that the surrounding streets were filled with a pitch-black and strange liquid. They surged over and quickly coagulated to form a strong cage. In such darkness, shadows began to come alive as cold gazes landed on him. A demigod's power. The Aurora Order does have a saint nearby. There's no way to directly teleport away. Klein's heart tensed up as he calmly flipped Laymanos Travels to the charred yellow page. Sizzle. A silver python snaked out of thin air, embroiling itself with the darkness as it illuminated everything. Lightning storm. The coagulated pitch blackness shattered instantly. And without any hesitation, Klein stuffed his death knell-wielding right hand into his pocket, pinching the dark green stone that was filled with burn marks. Door. He chanted in ancient Hermes with an abnormally calm tone. A light blue brilliance burst out as Klein's figure rapidly turned into a blur. Even Mr. X's corpse, which had come close to grab onto his shoulder, had experienced similar changes. The two figures instantly turned invisible as they vanished from the spot. They quickly departed into the spirit world with overlapping saturated colors, pulling off an ingenious escape. In the shadowy alley with the flattened gathering building which had planks, rubble, clothes, and all kinds of random items strewn all around, someone harumphed. Damn it! At this moment, the other gathering members had already fled the street. From far away in the sky, a sonic boom could be heard. Zio and Furs, who were searching for ghosts in East Borough, were alarmed by the sky that suddenly lit up. They hurriedly looked into the distance and saw the silver forest that seemed to bloom like a forest. The twisted form and sense of horror had left them trembling despite the distance. They didn't even dare look straight at it. What happened over there? Zio mumbled as she exchanged looks with Furs blankly. Furs actually had a guess, but she found it difficult to believe. This was because it had far exceeded her expectations of the world Gehrman Sparrow's strength. In a dark alley, Klein appeared out of thin air with Mr. X's corpse as they landed on the ground. He wasn't flustered at all. He kept Death Knell in his pocket and then took out another book. Grozel's Travels. Smack. Klein smacked the book written by Dragon of Imagination Ankwelt onto Mr. X's face, staining the cover with blood. Moments later, Mr. X's corpse vanished, leaving behind Wraith Seigneur in his dark red coat and old triangular hat. Right on the heels of that, Klein put away Grozel's Travels, flipped open Laymanos Travels and made another charred yellow page face up. Suddenly, a bright light emitted from the book as an illusory angel with 12 wings flew up and landed on Klein. All of this happened in an instant before darkness returned to the alley. Only the dim moonlight continued illuminating the area silently. Klein immediately took out another metal bottle, poured out the blood stored inside, and uniformly smeared it across Laymanos Travels. After doing all of this, he put away everything else, pulling away the hooded robe and throwing it beside him. A scarlet flame immediately soared up, burning the tattered robe clean. Meanwhile, Klein silently grew another 10 centimeters as he transformed into a relatively ordinary appearance. Then, he identified his bearings with the help of the stars, and he picked up a fallen branch to assist him as he quickly toured through the dark and deteriorated streets, returning back to the cheap motel. At this point, he still had no idea what additional weakness he had been given. Inside the single room in the motel, Klein changed into his own clothes, turning back into Gehrman Sparrow. Seeing this thin and cold-looking crazy adventurer in the mirror, he fell silent for a few seconds, picking up the half-top hat and wearing it. Above the flattened building, Church of Storms Cardinal, Backlund Diocese Archbishop, deep blue officiant Randall Valentinus, who had failed in capturing anyone, looked down in silence for an extended period of time. 160 Backlund Street. Upon seeing the visitor outside, Butler Walter asked in surprise, "Your Excellency, why are you suddenly here? Is there something?" Bishop Electra chuckled and said, "I heard that Dwayne is sick, so I'm here to visit him. Perhaps he will quickly recover under the goddess's blessings." Chapter 780, Extract. Walter came to the third story and rapped on the master bedroom's door. "Who is it?" Dwayne Dantes' slightly weak and hoarse voice sounded. Walter turned the doorknob, opening a tiny crack in the door. "Sir, Bishop Electra is here to visit you. Do you wish to meet him in the living room or activity room, or should he be invited directly to your bedroom?" Usually, visitors weren't permitted to enter the master's bedroom. This was rather impolite, but visiting the sick was an exception. After a brief silence, Dwayne Dantes replied, "Invite him into the bedroom." "All right, sir." As Walter gestured Richardson to urge a maid to prepare some tea, he walked down and invited Bishop Electra of the Church of Evernight up. Soon, Electra entered the bedroom and saw Dwayne Dantes lying in bed, looking haggard. "Richardson, get the bishop a seat," the pale Dwayne Dantes said with a smile. Richardson had already done so. He immediately moved a high-back chair to a spot near the bed. However, Electra took a few steps forward to observe the new tycoon in town and asked in concern, "Dwayne, how are you? Did you consult a physician?" His spiritual perception wasn't triggered, so he didn't make any attempts. He was only visiting a pious believer out of concern. Dwayne Dantes coughed lightly and smiled. "I'm actually almost recovered. I believe I'll be able to head over to church tomorrow or the day after tomorrow to listen to your preachings." "That's good. I was wondering if I needed to pray to Goddess to bless you." Electra chuckled and took a step back before sitting on the chair which Richardson had brought for him. At this moment, Dwayne Dantes glanced at the bishop and chuckled. "Actually, I've always had a question. Are clergymen of the Church of the Goddess allowed to get married?" Electra, who was 2 years short of reaching 40, sighed and smiled. "This question has actually troubled us for the longest time. In ancient times, the archbishops had engaged in intense debates about this on several theosophical meetings. One side believed that servants of the goddess need to maintain their purity, be it men or women, otherwise it would be sacrilegious. The other side found words from the goddess in the Revelation of Evernight and other books, believing that the goddess encouraged marriage. She encouraged equality between both sexes and for them to have normal contact. Hence, clergymen should be an example of this, and not be a negative example. By doing so, that would be the greatest respect towards the goddess. In recent times, this question has basically been shelved. The church doesn't ban or encourage it. The only request is that married clergymen are not to let their families live in the cathedrals. Dwayne Dantes nodded slowly as he curled the corner of his lips. "Your Excellency, do you have a wife?" Although Bishop Electra was thin and not very good-looking, he was pleasant to the eyes. He sighed and said, hardly hiding his smile, 2 years ago, I walked down the aisle under the goddess's watch. I happened to have a child this year. I originally imagined that I would remain single my entire life in order to serve Goddess, but, as he spoke, he gave a self-deprecating laugh and shook his head. Without waiting for Dwayne Dantes to probe deeper, Electra asked, "You seem to be single as well. Are you considering the problem of marriage?" He seemed to imagine that Dwayne Dantes had such thoughts, and he directly asked, imagining that the answer was certain as he continued, "What kind of lady do you like? Perhaps I might be able to help introduce you to someone." Dwayne Dantes coughed lightly and said with a smile, "I often chose adventures to amass wealth in the past, so I wasn't willing to get married, afraid I would drag her down. Heh, I like many types of women and am not picky. I like those older than me, ones who can give me warmth and make me feel at ease." Before he finished, his valet, Richardson, wore a stunned expression. He hurriedly turned his head aside and lowered it. He felt his face burning for some baffling reason. Dwayne Dantes didn't seem to sense it as he continued, "I also like those younger than me, those who are pure and lively, making anyone who sees them feel as though it's dawn because of the radiance they aren't aware of." Bishop Electra's face suddenly froze as he raised his palm and clenched it into a fist as he held it to his mouth and coughed twice. Yet, Dwayne Dantes didn't stop. He shook his head and said with a sigh, "I also like those who were once in love or were married so that people wouldn't dare approach due to their status, women who can only be viewed from afar. They are so charming that each action of theirs are so intoxicating and irresistible. I often dream," Butler Walter, who was standing nearby, trembled. He felt as though he had experienced a dream that he didn't wish to wake up from despite opposing it greatly. He had no idea if it was a good or bad dream. Dwayne Dantes was about to continue to describe further, but he stopped producing any sound after opening his mouth. He then chuckled softly. "That's all very normal. When humans are at their limits and are under the influence of their senses, they often have some abnormal thoughts. As long as they're repressed while acting in line with one's will, it wouldn't feel like torture. One would still be a husband, a good father, a good man. That's very reasonable. When I'm incensed, I often have irrational thoughts, but few people will turn them into reality." Bishop Electra ingeniously changed the subject. As for Butler Walter and valet Richardson, they revealed looks of contemplation. The bishop didn't stay long. After drinking a few sips of the marquis black tea that the maid delivered, he got up and bade farewell, leaving Dwayne Dantes's residence. The room quickly turned quiet as the window at the balcony silently opened. Klein, who had changed back into Dwayne Dantes, agilely leaped inside. "Thankfully, I returned in time. If I allowed Rhodes to continue speaking, Bishop Electra would probably renounce a pious believer like me. Perhaps I'll even discover Walter and Richardson hanging from their rooms tomorrow morning, and the streets would have rumors of Dwayne Dantes being a pervert." Klein looked at the fake Dwayne on the bed and sighed silently. That final response had been personally formulated by him, and he got Rhodes to read it. Of course, this was his contingency plan for the worst possible scenario. He had believed that Rhodes wouldn't have made the situation develop that far. "Welcome back, great master." The Dwayne Dantes in bed bowed and greeted. "Did your loyal and humble servant, Rhodes, do well?" Hearing the mirror stammer the question, Klein sighed and said, "It's still all right. You did pretty good. However, try not to agitate others when chatting." I will take note." The fake Dwayne Dantes rapidly vanished as a small mirror appeared on the pillow. Above the mirror, silver light bloomed as words appeared, "Thank you for your affirmation. I will continue following in your footsteps. I look forward to being of service to you the next time." After a goodbye expression was sketched out, the mirror returned to normal. Klein went close to it and put away the mirror before entering the bathroom attached to the master bedroom. He took 4 steps counterclockwise and headed above the gray fog. He wanted to complete the grazing before Mr. X's spirit body dispersed. In the book world, inside a cave on a snow-laden mountain peak, Klein looked at Mr. X's corpse and carefully identified the head that had been pieced together from the fragments. He matched it with his memories of the target's picture which Miss Magician had provided him. "It's him. I hope I'll obtain traveling and record. With them, I would make a killing with this operation. Otherwise, I'll have to consider getting Miss Magician to pay more." The difficulty between hunting a Sequence 5 and that of facing a demigod are 2 completely different matters. As Klein thought, he reached out his left palm and spread open his fingers, aiming at the corpse whose spirituality hadn't completely dispersed. Creeping hunger quickly transformed back into its original form, looking as though it was made of thin human skin. 2 eyes split open in the middle of its palm. Its pupils were bright red, as though they were dyed in blood. Amidst a cold and eerie wind, Mr. X's significantly dispersed spirit body in the resplendent beyonder specks of light that resembled the Milky Way drilled into Creeping Hunger, fixing onto a blank finger. Creeping Hunger first turned transparent as if it was a shadow of the spirit world before returning to normal. Klein closed his eyes and sensed it as his brows gradually eased. A smile surfaced on his face. His luck was pretty good this time because he had drawn one of the beyonder powers he wanted the most, Traveler's Door. It could also be called Door of Teleportation, or Traveling. Its effect was to allow a person to traverse the spirit world while sensing the external world. Beyonders of different sequences could endure traveling for different periods of time due to the differences in their spirit body's potency. This made the effects of spirit world traversal and the distance differ. If it's a sequence 9 or 8, they wouldn't be able to go beyond Backlund. With my present level, I wonder if I can directly head to the primitive island which Mr. Hanged Man provided. If that doesn't work, I can split it into a few trips. Klein thought as he smiled. At this point, he realized that a traveler's strength in head-on combat was very powerful. This was because the difficulty in using short-distance traveling was about the same as flaming jump. This also meant that a traveler could keep phasing around a target, opening up and narrowing distances as they pleased. This would catch people by surprise while also preventing them from inflicting a successful blow. Furthermore, if plenty of powers were recorded and the vigilance that accompanies immediately departing once something felt amiss, Klein suspected that even with lightning storm and hurricane, he had no way of restraining a traveler in direct combat. Indeed, a marionettist should try to hide behind the shadows. As Klein thought poignantly, he cast his eyes on Mr. X's corpse. Creeping Hunger had also obtained another beyonder power. It was door opening of the apprentice sequence. It was equivalent to a very weakened version of traveling and was of little value. Turning his gaze, Klein's eye noticed the ruby ring on Mr. X's hand. Chapter 781, Negative Effects. After staring at Mr. X's corpse for a while, Klein held back the urge to personally dig through his pockets for spoils of war. He made Wraith Senior take 2 steps and retrieve the ruby ring. This way, even if Mr. X carried an item with unimaginable negative effects, it would be endured by the marionette and not affect himself. After some careful inspecting, Senior held the ruby ring, 48 pounds in cash, and an ordinary pipe filled with tobacco and walked back. That's all? An Oracle of the Aurora Order only has this much? Klein was rather surprised at this scene as he nearly cursed "pauper" at him. Soon, he recovered his calm and used his reasoning to convince himself that such a situation was very reasonable. Mr. X is a traveler. He can record the beyonder powers of others. He's considered an all-rounder. Even if such a powerhouse were to have other mystical items, he would tend to record them and not carry them around. This way, he could enjoy the benefits of the powers without suffering from the negative effects. That can prevent himself from killing himself. Using this line of thought, the effects of this ring was likely to be passive or triggered. With this in mind, Klein nodded gently. He made Senior carry Mr. X's cracked and sticky head, possess him, and return above the gray fog. Sitting behind the fool's seat, he was no longer afraid of anything. He directly took the ruby ring and used the method of divination in order to determine the actual effects of the mystical item. Its name is Flower of Blood. It allows the wearer to control their body at a deeper level. As long as they don't suffer from instant death or are completely purified, hence, losing the ability to control it, they will be able to slowly recover. This is equivalent to an instinct, a passive effect. From the looks of it, my choice of delivering a lethal strike with Death Knell was the correct one. If I hadn't used all my might, Mr. X might not have actually died. He would then be able to use the extreme pain to awaken himself and escape the control of a marionettist. He had also considered his weakness of being more of a spellcaster and having a body that was insufficient in strength. This ring has flesh magic to a certain degree. It's quite useful. As Klein held the ruby ring, he rapped the edge of the model table and muttered silently. He then began probing the Flower of Blood's negative effects. Nearly a minute later, Klein opened his eyes and left the dream. Oh, come on. This? He muttered as he wore a twisted look. With dream divination, he had interpreted the flower of blood's negative effects. It involved randomly making the wearer lose all rationale and the ability to think. Great. This is in line with the true creator. Klein couldn't help but grind his teeth. A negative effect that was completely random meant that the flower of blood had no way to be used. Thinking back to the scene from before, Klein muttered to himself in an amused and peeved manner, Mr. X actually dared to wear such a ring? That's right, people who change their faith to the true creator often don't have any facility to think. In that case, wearing such a ring wouldn't make them worse. Losing rationale isn't losing reason. It wouldn't be as bad as suddenly hurting others. But clearly, he would be very rigid and foolish, acting only on instinct. Phew. Klein heaved a sigh of relief. He decided to throw the flower of blood into the junk pile and not vex over it. From his point of view, it was a piece of crap that he couldn't use, nor was anyone willing to buy it unless he sold it to the Aurora Order. However, that would only make the true creator very happy. At that moment, he caught sight of Admiral of Blood Senor who was standing beside him through the corner of his eye. Klein's heart stirred as he clapped. Why didn't I think of that? I might not be able to use it, but I can let my marionette use it. After all, he's dead and he follows all my instructions. He doesn't need to think. Admiral of Blood, Flower of Blood. It's destined to be a pair. Although Senor has lost his control over his body because he's dead, I can provide that. This way, he can still be fixed even if he can't phase into a wraith in time, or if his zombie body isn't strong enough to withstand a blow, causing him to lose a limb or two. Of course, to a marionette, that's not important, as it doesn't affect his intrinsic character. The main goal is to obtain the additional flesh magic. A few seconds later, a delighted Klein made Senor pick up the ruby ring and wear it on his left index finger. After doing this, Klein made the wraith return to the gold coin before he raised his left palm and spread his fingers. He wanted to release the interrogator from creeping hunger. This was a promise he had made a long time ago. This was the last spirit body that had been grazed when he received creeping hunger. It was time to set it free. Amidst an indistinct cold wind, a blurry soul appeared by the side of the bronze table. He was a man in a navy uniform. He was in his 30s and had the rank of commander. He had brown whiskers on his painful and dazed face. What's your name? How did Kalangos kill you? Klein asked in a deep voice. The man jolted from his reverie and answered, My name is Andy Hayden. The second mate of the Enmat. I died at a battle at sea. No, I didn't die immediately. I was captured by a Phasation before I entered that glove of yours. I do not know of a Kalangos, much less heard of him. This interrogator was already inside the glove when Kalangos obtained creeping hunger? As psychic piercing is very useful, he didn't switch it. I wonder who the previous owner of creeping hunger was. Klein asked with piqued interest, who was the Phasation who caught you? What does he look like? Andy Hayden thought seriously and said, I don't know his name. I only remember his epaulet was that of a captain. I remember that he had a big, impressionable nose. I remember his eyes were blue, and his hair was close to blonde. He was almost 2 meters tall. Such people from Phasak are common, other than his identity as a captain. Klein considered for a moment and said, Which year did you die? Andy Hayden's figure slowly dissipated away, and finally, it said, 1338, that's 12 years ago. Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos got famous less than 10 years ago. That captain might already be an admiral. Klein gently nodded and discovered that he had failed to ask if Andy Hayden had any last wishes. Forget it, setting him free is already a good deed. Klein quickly threw the matter to the back of his mind as he conjured the World Gehrman Sparrow. Please inform Miss Magician that Mr. X, Louis Veen, is dead. Please get her to take receipt of the item and the spellbook. I'll request it from her when I need it again. An endless gray fog filled Furza's eyes as the World Gehrman Sparrow's words emotionlessly rang in her ears. Although she was already prepared for this piece of news, she still found it unbelievable and unacceptable. He really succeeded? That storm in Eastborough was created by him? Furs held down the upheavals in her heart. Taking advantage of the silent night, she set up a bestowment ritual in her bedroom. Before long, the candlelight and spirituality items created an illusory door. 2 items flew out and landed gently on the table. When Furs took a careful look, she nearly screamed as she hurriedly covered her mouth. She took 2 steps back and kept close to the wall of spirituality. One of the 2 items was her Lamino's travels, while the other item was a hideous head covered in cracks. It was stained with blood as if they had pieced together, as it seemed to shimmer with what appeared like reflected light on glass. As a graduate of med school, and having worked as a doctor at a well-known clinic, Furs had seen her fair share of corpses, but never had she seen such a disgusting, creepy, and terrifying head. After composing herself, Furs looked at the head again, identifying it to be Louis Vine's. She carefully used astromancy to make a final confirmation. Following that, she muttered with a slightly twisted expression, "Mr. World shattered the target's head and then pieced them back together?" At this moment, Furs couldn't help have a scene surface in her mind. It was of the cold German sparrow sitting in front of a table, piecing together the bloody head fragments together, as though seriously putting a jigsaw puzzle together. This made Furs involuntarily shiver. She had an inexplicable feeling that the world was a psychotic killer with a serious mental illness. Moving her gaze away, she took 2 steps forward and picked up Lamino's travels and casually flipped through it. Her gaze gradually froze because there were more spells in the spellbook, most of them seemingly related to wind and lightning. This made her recall the lightning storm that quickly passed in Eastborough. She was convinced that it was created by Mr. World. Furs hurriedly flipped to the 3 charred yellow pages in Lamino's travels and found them blank. She immediately had a guess, believing that the World German Sparrow had likely gained Mr. Fool's help to record beyond her powers at the demigod level. "I just realized that if I have enough money and resources, I can hire the Tarot Club members to help me record different Beyonder powers. This way, Lamino's travels will become extremely powerful, but I don't have the money or resources. I can request for a reward from teacher this time. I can say that I paid quite a price to help seek revenge for him." Furs thought and first thanked Mr. Fool before asking him to pass on the message to the world. "I'm very sorry that my payment isn't proportionate to the difficulty of the mission. After I receive a reward, I'll provide compensation." After the prayer, Furs ended the ritual and hurriedly hid the head. If Zio discovers this, she'll definitely imagine a horror story. After she was done, Furs clapped her hands as she thought leisurely. When Furs replied, Klein had already returned to the real world. All he heard was a vague female's voice. But even so, he couldn't help the fear and horror he felt. This was because Death Knell had given him an additional weakness, the fear of women. Chapter 782, Saturday night. On Saturday morning, Klein, who was wearing pajamas, rubbed his head and got out of bed. He didn't sleep well, as different women would inevitably enter his dreams, scaring him awake. He needed to spend several seconds to calm his emotions before returning to sleep again. Thankfully, this weakness only lasts 6 hours, and there's no need for me to head out in the middle of the night. I didn't have to face the maids. Klein sighed as he pulled the rope beside his bed. Richardson, who had been waiting outside, immediately entered with the clothes his employer needed to wear. "I've no idea what a road said. Richardson seems to try to avoid me when facing me. Was it the kind of ladies he mentioned he likes, and that it happens to also be at odds with how society views it?" Klein happened to only hear the magic mirror mention the kind of women that Butler Walter liked when he rushed back. He wasn't sure what had happened prior to that. He didn't use dream divination to obtain the corresponding information, as he didn't feel that it was necessary. After all, with Richardson's personality, he wouldn't have the courage to take action no matter who he liked. It wouldn't have had any additional effects. After changing into his clothes, Klein headed to the second story and walked to the dining room. Walter was wearing white gloves as usual, waiting by the entrance. Upon seeing Dwayne Dante's approach, he took a step forward and bowed politely. "Good morning, sir. You have 2 lessons today. In the evening, you will be participating in the banquet at Mr. Portland Moment's place." Portland Moment lived at 100 Backlund Street. He was a full-time professor at Backlund University's Department of Engineering, a fellow at the Lone Kingdom Imperial Science Institute. As he had discovered a few metal alloys, he had received the Light of Machinery Award, and he was just second to people like Tirani von Helmesuen in the world of academics. Furthermore, the few metal alloys were widely used in ship and steam engine construction. Just the licensing patent was enough to make him a tycoon with a wealth of hundreds of thousands of pounds. Upon hearing Walter, Klein casually glanced at him, realizing that he had some dark eye circles. His eye bags were a little puffy, making him look different from usual. It was as though he hadn't slept well the entire night. If not for a faceless powers, Dwayne Dante's would probably look the same. Klein retracted his gaze in pity and didn't speak further. As he nodded gently in response to Walter's greetings, he entered the dining hall. To be honest, Klein was rather impressed with him. He was able to hold back his fantasies and stop himself from approaching her to seek out pleasure, despite frequently meeting a demoness. All he did was have wet dreams that included the target when alone at night. One had to know that a demoness, especially one who was in the midst of or having passed the pleasure sequence, had a charm that far exceeded a beyonder's effects towards males. Every action was filled with a charm that made any men who came close to them feel intoxicated and lost. It was like consuming opioids and gradually developing into something more serious, to the point of not being able to extricate oneself from the pleasure given by a demoness. Perhaps only gay men could effectively resist such charms. Of course, Klein suspected that gay men were not immune to it either. This was because one's mind and hormones would be affected, creating changes that originally didn't exist. Furthermore, a large number of demonesses were men to begin with. This lowered one's psychological resistance. And precisely because of this, even though he was a Sequence 5 Beyonder, Klein had to constantly maintain a high-strung state when facing demonesses like Trissy and Tracy. He was afraid that any mishap might cause him to be charmed. Even he wasn't immune to such effects, much less an ordinary person like Butler Walter. This wasn't something that willpower alone could resist. Although perhaps being a result of Prince Edisac's death or her own advancement, Trissy was clearly able to rein in her charms. Walter is only an ordinary person. Even if he is one, he's at best a Sequence 9 or 8. For him to maintain his present state implies how strong his self-restraint is. He's very loyal to Prince Edisac, and he loves his wife and daughter. As Klein sighed, he sat down. Breakfast today was his favorite desi pie. The oil that effused out of it made him salivate. The sea late at night was nearly black as it was faintly dyed with a sliver of crimson red. It was calmer and quieter than in the day. The Blue Avenger was ebbing up and down in the waves like a ghost as it cruised towards the crimson moon. Alger Wilson stood at the bow, looking far away at the waves. On the surface, he appeared staid as usual, but deep down, he could hardly hold back his agitation. Ahead of him was the abyss maelstrom north of Sonia Island. As it was a dangerous vortex that was famous for appearing without any signs, no ship was willing to enter these dangerous waters. After delivering the report and leaving Pasu Island, Alger commandeered the Blue Avenger all the way north where they circled around Sonia Island and headed for this area. Midway, they had docked at a harbor for resupplies without wasting any more time. As for whether he would be suspected for heading north, Alger wasn't worried. This was because the Church of Storms was happy to have its captains head north of the Sonia Sea and the Fog Sea in order to obtain intel on the Fasak Empire, Intis Kingdom, Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun, and the Church of the God of Combat. Looking back at his ship, Alger walked deckside, took out a charm made of tin, held it in his palm, and chanted the incantation, Storm. A blue flame soared and devoured the charm. Alger suddenly sensed a baffling affinity with all the fish in the ocean beneath him. At that instant, both parties were able to communicate at the psyche level. The tin charm was one of the items he had obtained from his resupply at Pasu Island, allowing him to have an affinity with undersea creatures, providing a crude level of psychic communication with him. Amidst his thoughts, Alger didn't think of obtaining any intel. All he did was wait for the Blue Avenger to approach the Alger maelstrom and make a second attempt. Seconds turned into minutes as Alger, who had failed nearly 100 times, finally learned from a spindle-like fish about where Obninsks often appeared. If I didn't know that the target is near the Abyss maelstrom, I would have long given up. It's really difficult to grasp any reliable information through a brute force search. Alger concluded as he touched his pocket. He had already used up most of his affinity charms, with only 5 left. I'll have to get another batch of them when I return. Others must not discover that I've expended all these. I heard the Rorsted Archipelago's resistance has plenty. Heh. As Alger was pondering, he changed the direction of the Blue Avenger for the spot he had just learned about. About an hour passed as the Blue Avenger stopped. Alger casually took out a sealed metal bottle. This was the sanguine anesthetic gas that he had spent 130 pounds to buy from the moon. He had no doubt in regards to its effects because he had used one in the past. As the Blue Avenger was a ghost ship, it didn't need many people to man it at night. There was only one person every night who was in charge of watching the ship, preventing it from deliberately creating problems or cruising into dangerous waters. As the captain, Alger had arranged himself to be on duty that night without anyone noticing. After he was done with his preparations, he came to the door of the sailors, took out a metallic pipe, and opened the bottle. He released the gas into each room, without even sparing the storeroom which stored all kinds of sundry. It was in case certain members of the crew were playing cards in there instead of sleeping. After doing all of this, Alger, who wasn't in a rush to concoct the potion, brought the ingredients with him, changing into a diving suit that was made of shark skin. He leaped from the starboard and into the water, without causing any splashes. Under the dark and calm waters, Alger's eyes gradually turned dark blue, allowing him to see his surroundings clearly. He breathed in the air within the water comfortably as he arrived in a pitch-black deep sea. Then, he used the affinity charm once again to communicate with the surrounding fish that were of different shapes and sizes. With the advice from the kind fish, Alger identified his bearings and swam as he asked, finally arriving at what seemed like an underwater volcano. The fish actually didn't know that an Obninsk stayed here. They only knew that their own kind and a number of top deep-sea hunters often disappeared in the vicinity. With his beyonder powers, Alger looked far ahead and saw the huge, black cave in the undersea volcano. Tentacles that were thicker than pythons found in a southern continent primitive forest gently flailed outwards. The huge suckers and patterned skin, as well as the cave that was several times the size of the Blue Avenger, left Alger apprehensive as he didn't dare approach. An Obninsk is at least a powerful sequence 5. Furthermore, it has a terrifying body. I can confirm that it's my target. Alger carefully swam over and stopped at a distance from the threat. After careful identification, he used the affinity charm once again. Following that, he allowed his spirituality to pass through the water and reach into the cave in an attempt to communicate with the powerful psyche force that was huddled inside. The massive psyche slowly relaxed as countless thoughts were released. It was taken aback for a moment before its psyche suddenly erupted like a volcano. Roar! Amidst a terrifying sound, the cave produced a ludicrous vortex that sucked the surrounding water, trash, as well as Alger towards it. It's filled with animosity. Alger's pupils constricted as his body turned slippery as he was driven by a formless wind backward in an attempt to escape. He used several beyonder powers before escaping the influence of the vortex. He didn't dare stay near the undersea volcano, and he quickly surfaced before opening up a gap. Almost a minute later, Alger, who had escaped the dangerous area, spat out bubbles as he heaved a sigh of relief. That Obninsk can actually resist the influence of charms that increase in affinity with sea creatures. Does it hate items with the Lord's aura? After some thought, Alger, who didn't wish to waste this opportunity, steeled his resolve since he had already come this far. He began using Elvish to pray amidst the seawater. The fool that doesn't belong to this era. Chapter 783, the trick to communication when he heard the illusory pleas. Klein was attending a banquet at Portland Moments Place due to the time difference. The banquet began from 7:30, and it continued all the way to 9:30, and even 10. This was because the appetizers, soup, side dishes, main dishes, staple food, vegetables, fruits, and desserts had numbered a total of 10 to 20 dishes. The footmen would serve the dishes one after the other, removing and changing dishes in unison to prevent the dining table from turning chaotic, and also providing an interval between the dishes in order to allow the guests to chat. Gentlemen would take the initiative to talk to the ladies to their right. In short, it's rather troublesome and exhausting. I even have to take note of which dish matches with which alcohol. However, it's quite tasty. Taking the opportunity when the roasted lamb was being switched out, he said to Ma'am Willis to his right, "My apologies. I'll need to use the washroom." He got up, pressing his right hand to his chest and bending over slightly as a gesture. Then, he left the dining hall and headed for one of the washrooms on the second story. Upon entering, he locked the door and immediately took 4 steps counterclockwise to head above the gray fog. Mr. Hanged Man's prayer. He wishes for me to help him in gaining the goodwill of an Obninsk, and he's willing to find 15 pages of Roselle's diary, or help me do something of equal value. His progress isn't slow. Klein sat at the fool's seat as he emanated his spirituality and touched the constantly burgeoning and contracting crimson star. After pondering for a few seconds, he said, "Investigate all Fay-Sac captains who participated in the Konotop Sea battle in 1338. As a historian, Klein immediately knew which sea battle it was when he learned that the interrogator had died at the hands of a Fay-Sacian in 1338. In 1338, the relationship between Lone and Fay-Sac was tense with occasional conflicts. However, there was only one battle that resulted in the death of someone that was at the level of a commander. It was a sea battle that happened in East Balam's Konotop. And on a Fay-Sacian fleet, there were definitely not many captains. In the deep, dark waters, Alger Wilson saw the endless grayish-white fog and heard Mr. Fool's answer. Investigate all the captains from the Fay-Sac Empire that were involved in the Konotop Sea battle in 1338. Why would Mr. Fool pay attention to such a trivial figure? Is there some immense secret hidden in this matter? Alger's heart stirred. Without any hesitation, he directly agreed. Your wish is my wish. Such a mission was difficult and very complicated for him, but it wasn't dangerous. It was something that the present him could accept. After the response, Alger heard Mr. Fool's deep voice once again. You can return to the target's vicinity. That's it? As expected of Mr. Fool. After he obtained the authority, he is more like a sea god than Calvetua. His might isn't limited to the Rorstad archipelago. Alger was delighted as he thanked the Fool solemnly. Then, bending his back and kicking his legs, he turned to head down, diving into the depths once more. In just minutes, he returned beside the undersea volcano and saw a turbulent flow in the gigantic dark cave as the tentacles were flailing and had yet to calm down. Although Alger trusted Mr. Fool in being sufficiently powerful and terrifying, an awakening ancient god, he instinctively became cautious when he saw that scene. He carefully inched forward. He suspected that the Obninsk's flailing of its countless tentacles was a sign of welcoming him. And at this moment, above the gray fog, the sea god scepter-wielding Klein frowned slightly. It refuses to communicate with sea god, and it even hates the feeling, making it unwilling to show its goodwill, he muttered under his breath, exasperated. His influence on the surrounding waters through the Prey had failed. For some unknown reason, the Obninsk strongly resisted beyonder powers that promoted an affinity with sea creatures. Through the prayer scene, he could see the thick tentacles thrashing about, and he vaguely sensed that the target was infuriated. It was trying to rip apart all living beings that dared approach it. Mr. Hanged Man has gone over. He's going over. The corners of Klein's mouth twitched as he decided to switch his approach. He raised the sea god's scepter a little higher, allowing the blue gems at the tip light up one after another, emitting a bright, blinding light. Right on the heels of that, he directed the violent aura of lightning storm over, casting it on the Obninsk. The thick tentacles that thrashed about at the bottom of the sea suddenly froze before falling down. They clung close to the seabed as countless green points of lights appeared in the dark cave. Amidst a jarring rumbling sound, a terrifying monster that could devour a sailboat crawled out. Its patterned black body was massive and distorted. It had a total of 3 heads, and each head had more than a dozen eyes. All of them were emitting a green light. The monster then prostrated, appearing as obedient as a trained hound. Indeed, tricks are needed in communication. Klein nodded in satisfaction and once again used the Beyonder affinity powers to make the Obninsk open the mouths of its 3 heads via a psychic connection. This made Alger instantly see 3 dark caves, each of them large enough to provide a sailboat passage inside. Praise be to Mr. Fool. Alger looked at the magnificent scene before him as he couldn't help but mutter inwardly. He didn't waste any time, and he chose the middle head by quickly swimming towards it. A spiraled and warped passage quickly appeared in Alger's vision as the walls were made of flesh. The width was comparable to the bow of the Blue Avenger. Whoosh! Water flowed into the passage, heading right for the deep depths. Alger took the opportunity to let his body go with the flow. Suddenly, he felt as though he was back as a sailor, engaging in combat amidst waves, groggy from being tossed around. It couldn't be sustained. By the time Alger used his Beyonder powers and got a hold of himself, he had already left the tunnel of flesh. He was in a dark, spacious world, with a sticky sensation by his feet. There was a putrid stench everywhere around him. In just a second, Alger realized that the liquid inside was corroding him. He hurriedly produced a water membrane as he made it swell into a transparent sphere. He knew that he was already inside the Obninsk stomach. Without any hesitation, he took out all the bottles he had long prepared and began concocting the potion. As the supplementary ingredients were thrown into the wide-mouthed metal bottle, they mixed into a dark blue liquid. Following that, Alger carefully threw in a jellyfish that enveloped azure blue seawater in its translucent membrane. The distant and ethereal singing grew in intensity before calming down. In the bottle, there wasn't any ripples or bubbles. The liquid was dark, just like the ocean before a storm. Alger calmed his mind, entered cogitation, and picked up the metal bottle before cleanly downing the ocean songster potion inside. The liquid was cold as it brought about a numbness that slid down his gullet and into his stomach. It then spread throughout his body cells at an unimaginable speed. At that instant, Alger vaguely heard countless voices. They came from all life at sea, but the Obninsk's body blocked most of it, leaving a relatively screened-out version. Plop! 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 Alger felt his heart beating violently as it spewed blood outwards. His spirituality and the sound waves began to remold his voice and soul. He couldn't help it as he opened his mouth, letting out a loud sigh. Amidst the sigh, Alger felt his spirit body being ripped slightly. As the sound waves spread outwards, they first turned into mottled scales on his skin before pulling out long flesh tendrils that appeared like flailing tentacles. The sound wave continued spreading outwards with his spirit body fragments, making contact with the sticky liquid within the Obninsk stomach, and they magically bounced back, infusing Alger's body once again. Alger, who was on the brink of losing control, instantly felt better as he seized the opportunity. Without any fear of embarrassing himself, he began singing loudly in a bid to vent the invisible sound waves that would blast his body apart. Rough, messy, off-tune singing filled with a metallic quality spread outwards, wave after wave, mixing with the numerous spirit body fragments before bouncing back on the Obninsk's sticky stomach walls. In this process, Alger was like an ingredient being baked in sound waves as he was molded into form. Finally, he regained control of his body, and he grasped his spreading spirituality. At last. Alger closed his eyes as a smile couldn't help but appear on his face. He had completed the first goal he had for all these years, to advance to Ocean Songster. I've gained superficial control of lightning, gaining a more all-round underwater mobility, as well as the ability to use singing to affect targets. The latter ability is different because of every person's uniqueness, producing different branching paths. One of them is to use beautiful singing to disrupt an enemy's spirit body, causing him to turn adrift and fall into a daze. Another is to raise one's explosive strength. Another is to simulate a thunderous boom to leave others in awe. And another is to use chaotic and unpleasant singing to leave the enemy frustrated, causing them to lose their rationality. Alger inspected himself as his expression turned a little odd. He soon put these thoughts away, picked up his items, and swam towards the Obninsk's mouth before gently tapping on the already closed mouth. The mouth slowly opened as it roared suddenly, spewing out everything in its mouth. Alger instantly felt as though he was in midair as he nearly collided with a shark. After a series of actions, he surfaced and swam towards the Blue Avenger. Only after the ghost ship's outline was reflected in his eyes did he truly heave a sigh of relief. Alger was only worried that something out of the ordinary would happen to the Blue Avenger while he was advancing. Although an hour or two wasn't a huge problem, there were always all kinds of surprises in this world. After receiving Mr. Hanged Man's gratitude again, Klein returned to the real world, washed, and dried his hands before leaving the washroom and walking towards the dining hall. As the fragrance of food inundated his olfactory senses once again, he slowly drew a breath as he returned to his seat with a smile. As he gestured to the guests, he sat down. At this point, it was already time for dessert. From the looks of it, I stayed too long in the washroom. I hoped that after today there wouldn't be talks about Dwayne Dante's having constipation. Klein silently muttered to himself as he smiled at Ma'am Willis to his right and said, "When I was young, I ate all kinds of strange food in the southern continent. One of them was called tennet tree plums. They taste like bland butter, just like these desserts." He euphemistically explained the reason for his delay by implying that he had weakened his stomach from his younger days. Chapter 784, Character Assassination. Ma'am Willis glanced at Dwayne Dantes and said with a smile, completely unfazed, "Your past, and your experiences in Desi Bay and the southern continent, are more interesting than any novel I've read. It makes me feel like having a similar experience of my own. Of course, they're just real-life stories that have been tweaked. It's all thanks to Anderson Hood, a hunter that goes everywhere." As Klein cast his gaze on a tiny butter cake, he chuckled. "It's because those are only the interesting ones. There are many that I'd rather not be reminded of." After that simple statement, he began enjoying the dessert. However, when Ma'am Willis and the other ladies heard that, they were somehow reminded of a best-selling novel, A Man with a Story. To them, Dwayne Dantes was such a man. Although he looked like a placid lake, there was more deep down. Hidden there were more pleasant surprises and plenty of pain. The banquet ended 20 minutes to 10. A number of gentlemen and ladies went to the card room to play 2 hours of Texas Hold'em, while the remaining men headed for the activity room to have a chat. They didn't bar women from joining, but as it was inevitable for them to broach on sexual matters while smoking, no women joined them. They either circled the piano at the first story and listened to and sang along with the performer, or they grouped up to play chess. Klein chose to head to the activity room on the second story. Private conversations with a few people had helped him speed up his admission into the circle. After entering the room, he observed the environment and went straight for the windows to open them. Then, he pulled a nearby high-back chair to sit down. Just as he did this, he saw the banquet's host, Portland Moment, laugh with a pipe in hand. Men often need some space for themselves. His voice was sonorous, and he had a big build. He was an elder in his 60s with a ruddy complexion and rather thick hair despite being all white. His facial features were the most classic features of a Loanese man with nothing that stood out. Yes, men have to take note of their image when the ladies are around. We have to be considerate about their thoughts. "I've already wanted to kiss this an hour ago," Hazel's father, member of parliament, mocked, took out a gorgeous silver box, taking out a cigar from inside. The other men in the activity room did the same as pipes or cigarettes appeared in their hands as though they were pulling off a magic trick. As the flames flickered, wisps of smoke began to billow, filling the room as though the smog from yesteryear hadn't dispersed. After enjoying it for a few seconds with his eyes closed, Portland Moment looked to the guest by the window and asked, "Dwayne, do you not smoke?" Klein clenched his fist and placed it to his mouth, coughing slightly as he said, I have yet to recover. The doctor advised me not to smoke for the time being. To be frank, he was almost choking. Thankfully, he had smartly chosen a seat by the window. This group smoke like chimneys. Klein curled his right index finger and rubbed against his nostrils. He had the urge to use the beyonder powers of a magician to create an invisible air pipe that extended outside to draw in fresh air so as to escape the harm of secondhand smoke. But considering how there might be beyonders hiding amongst these men, he wisely gave up on the idea. Portland Moment laughed upon hearing that. I heard from Bishop Electra that it's not without reason that you were sick. You lack a wife. This professor was a believer of the god of steam and machinery, but his wife was a believer of the Evernight goddess. Therefore, they had taken up residence in Buckland Street near St. Samuel Cathedral. He often had bishops visiting him and having exchanges. Is he mocking me for thinking about women despite being sick? I really couldn't tell that Bishop Electra is actually a man who likes spreading gossip. It's all a Rhodes's fault. Klein lampooned and shook his head with a smile. I place great importance on marriage. I'd rather remain single if there's no one suitable. At this moment, the high-ranking employee of the Backland Municipal Office, Mr. Willis, spewed out smoke and said, "Actually, I envy Dwayne's single status. It allows him to be able to pursue any kind of woman that he likes." He had deliberated enunciated any kind, causing ambiguous laughter to sound out. The matter of Dwayne Dantes's wide preferences and him never rejecting any charming woman has already spread across this street. Klein held back his right hand to prevent himself from subconsciously rubbing his temples. He felt that the deep, dignified, handsome, gregarious new tycoon's image was undergoing a subtle change. He first suspected that it was the loudmouth, Bishop Electra, that had spread the news, but later believed that it was Butler Walter who had proactively gotten the servants to spread the gossip. This was because a nearly flawless, charming gentleman would often be unknowingly ostracized by members of the same sex in a circle. But when a blemish surfaced, with a topic that could be used in jest, it made it easier for him to build closer ties. Klein wasn't angry about such treatment. Instead, he deliberately gave a wry smile in a rather gentlemanly manner. That's why I have difficulty choosing, causing me to remain single to this day. Haha. Portland Moment and company laughed in unison. Member of Parliament mocked then said, "What you need is to be a little more decisive. A good marriage and a good family aids a man greatly." He stopped teasing him and gave serious advice. From the looks of it, no matter which world you're in, you can't escape the fate of being pressured into marriage. Klein nodded gently and glanced out the window, taking in the night scenery of Portland Moment's garden. At this moment, he saw a figure. It was Hazel Mocked, who was dressed in a black-green gown, following a trail going deeper into the garden, pausing from time to time to look around as though she was looking for something. Wasn't this lady playing the piano just now? Why would she suddenly be in the garden? When Klein retracted his gaze, Hazel's figure was blocked by flowers. When guests attend banquets or balls, leaving the hall to head into the garden isn't something impolite. After all, it's a very stylish habit to take a stroll under the moon and take in the flowery aroma of the night winds. However, this often implies a rendezvous. Who's Hazel rendezvousing with? No, it doesn't seem like it. No one that came today is truly her equal. Although she doesn't appear as arrogant after the fright she suffered in the sewers, making her occasionally look depressed, she still seems to belittle ordinary people deep down. She's dealing with the negative effects of the mystical item? That doesn't make sense. Entering a lounge or the washroom would be better than the garden since there's more privacy. Furthermore, back at the ball held at her place, she also went to the third story and not the garden. Klein eliminated the various impossibilities and finally had a theory. From the way Hazel is trying to sense or find something, she seems to have noticed some abnormality and plans to observe and deal with it up close. Does this also mean that there's some paranormal activity happening in Professor Portland Moment's house? If that's true, this professor or someone in his family isn't simple at all. The bishops of the St. Samuel Cathedral haven't realized anything despite them visiting often. A marauder's senses and observation skills in certain areas definitely stand out. Klein didn't have any thoughts of intervening in the situation outside. After all, something that Hazel could sense was definitely nothing too dangerous. Besides, St. Samuel Cathedral was nearby. If there were any hidden secrets, no one would attempt to escalate matters and would instead try to lay low. At this moment, Mocht finally calmed down from an untasteful joke and looked towards Portland Moment. I heard you'll be leaving Backlund University. Professor Portland Moment sucked at his pipe and said, That's right. The Higher Education Commission wishes that I become the Chancellor of the reorganized Backlund University of Technology. Although a large amount of my wealth comes from metal alloys, what I'm best at is mechanical engineering. They've promised to build me a better laboratory there, and also provide me with more funding. At my age, having more autonomy and helpers is more important. Mr. Willis echoed with a smile, and Backlund University will have a full-time professor spot empty up. Those senior associate professors that have been waiting for decades can finally have a chance. In Lone's tertiary education system, full-time professors weren't just a title, but also a post. It was equivalent to a dean, so there was only one. Backlund University of Technology. Klein smiled as he listened, keeping silent on matters he didn't know much about. In the garden, Hazel arrived in a dark and secluded corner. She had discovered that ants and other insects on the ground were gathering in an abnormal manner, and her spiritual perception felt that something was hidden here. This was innate to her sequence, and it had never failed in the past. Without any additional help, she could directly choose the precious items hidden among several sealed boxes. Of course, she wasn't able to distinguish what it was exactly. All she knew was that compared to the rest, what her spiritual perception told her was something definitely more valuable. Just like Mr. Dwayne Dante's. He definitely has extremely precious items on him. Hazel curled the corners of her lips as she cast her gaze at the soil, which looked a little loose. She sensed that copious amounts of spirituality were gathered underneath, thus attracting insects and souls. It's not a human body. It's some spirituality-equipped materials that have been used. They should have been thrown away in batches, but they were instead buried together, causing unnecessary changes. Hazel's eyes turned darker as she interpreted the situation underground based on the unhidden spirituality traits and changes. She tipped her chin slightly and looked back at the building. She believed that Portland Moment's family had at least one person with extraordinary powers. And if this problem in the garden wasn't resolved, the nearby houses would have paranormal activity in the coming days. Hazel retracted her gaze, extended her left hand, and aimed it at the soil. With a gentle grip, she slowly twisted her wrist. The gathered spirituality vanished as though it had been stolen by someone. Chapter 785, Trissy's Discovery 100 Backlund Street, in a corner of the garden in Portland Moment's residence. The many ants and worms that were gathering there slowly dispersed as the cold, creepy sensation faded. That person with extraordinary powers likely doesn't have any experience. With her goal achieved, Hazel nodded indiscernibly before turning around briskly and strolling through the garden. She wasn't in a rush to return as she enjoyed the crimson moonlight, the cold air, and the faint flowery scent. After a long while, Hazel stopped her stroll and left the garden, entering the hall on the first story. At this moment, apart from the guests still playing Texas Hold'em, many ladies and gentlemen had bid farewell. Moments after Hazel found her mother, Ma'am Rihanna, she saw her father, Member of Parliament Mocht, and a few other gentlemen walking down as they conversed with lively expressions. Are you ready to head home? You have to visit a very important guest tomorrow morning. As Rihanna gestured for her daughter to come close, she walked towards her husband and greeted the others with a smile. Mocht nodded and said, I would have loved to try another of Portland's cigars if not for that matter. Rihanna swept her gaze to Willis, Dwayne Dantes, and company, and she asked in passing, Gentlemen, what are you talking about? It sounds interesting. Mocht turned his body to the side and said with a smile, Dwayne said that he encountered ghosts when he was in the southern continent. He and his companions suddenly woke up in the middle of the night and found themselves unable to open their eyes. Their bodies were heavy, as though someone was pressing on them. They used a great deal of strength before escaping such a state and left their beds. However, they discovered their rooms were extremely cold. You might not know this, but East Balam's weather is hot most of the time. Then, Dwayne and his companions each held double-barreled hunting rifles and stood guard the entire night. They frantically left the town after the sun rose. After hearing that, Ma'am Rihanna looked at Dwayne Dantes with piqued interest. Is that true? Do ghosts really exist? Klein shook his head with a smile. That I'm not sure of. Perhaps my companions and I had just experienced a harrowing adventure and our bodies and minds weren't in the best of conditions. This might have resulted in all kinds of problems. The stories he told were sourced from one of Anderson's experiences. Back when the strongest hunter of the Fog Sea was exploring a temple in the primitive forest, he chanced upon a specter, creating a large-scale breakout overnight. Ghosts. Hazel turned her head to look towards the garden as the corners of her mouth curved up slightly before she held back. She didn't say a word as she quietly listened to her parents bidding the rest of them farewell before returning home together. Late at night, Hazel, who had changed into a sleeping gown, walked to the balcony and stood behind a gap in the curtains. She looked towards the sewer manhole on Buckland Street. As she looked at it, her face gradually turned pale as though she had recalled an experience filled with pain and horror. She forced herself to retract her gaze, took 2 deep breaths, and turned around to walk to her bedside. During this process, she bit gently on her lip and muttered silently, "That was likely a wraith." Definitely. I need items or charms in the sun domain. While Hazel was looking at the manhole, Klein was also doing the same. It's been days. I wonder how well that demoness, Trissy, has recovered and whether she has left or not. Thankfully, after Hazel was given a scare by me, she hasn't dared to approach the manhole. Klein's gaze swept the iron-black street lamps as he nodded slightly. He opened the iron cigar case and made his wraith marionette appear within the full-body mirror. He had already decided to send Seigneur down the sewers to check the area to confirm Trissy's condition. He didn't want that demoness to cause any trouble. Furthermore, the sewers were just physically too close to his identity as Dwayne Dantes. Klein didn't wish for Trissy to be in the vicinity any longer, wishing that she could recover soon and take action. That would prompt her to leave Buckland Street. Having Admiral of Blood Seigneur appear every once in a while would fulfill the character setting I previously created. It doesn't live nearby, and because the sewers contains a secret, it often wanders around in search of it. As Klein was thinking, he made the marionette in the ancient triangular hat leap onto the street lamp surface before passing through the manhole cover in a wraith form, quickly approaching the hidden fork where Trissy hid herself at. Before reaching the dead end, Seigneur, who had night vision, could see that the area was empty. She's already recovered and left? Klein thought as he made the marionette continue forward, stopping at the spot where Trissy was previously sitting. He discovered that the place was tidied up. Not only was the ground not muddy and moist, even the moss on the walls and corner had vanished. There isn't any leftover food either. That fellow became a germaphobe after becoming a woman? No, perhaps he was like that to begin with. With Seigneur's vision, Klein surveyed the area and determined that either Trissy hadn't left, or she hadn't left for more than a day, otherwise, it was impossible to maintain the cleanliness of the place. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, light footsteps sounded into the wraith's ear. Under his control, Seigneur retraced his steps and wasn't surprised to see Trissy in her black dress. This demoness had her luscious black hair cascading down, unlike peers her age who had different hairstyles. It was simple and neat. Matched with her pale face that had just recovered some of its ruddiness, Trissy looked like a dreamy flower that was silently blooming in the night. As expected of a demoness. Thankfully, there's a marionette in between us, otherwise, would just end up staring at her. Heh, a dead person won't be enticed. No matter how charming a demoness is, there's no way they can make the deceased climb out of a tomb like a zombie. Klein lampooned as he looked at Trissy, who had a blank expression but was secretly wary, having released the invisible threads. Where did you go? Trissy pricked up her brows and said, would you like to relieve yourself where you sleep? I thought a demoness wouldn't need to use the washroom. Klein gave a self-deprecating comment and made Senor chuckle. Are you referring to pissing and shitting? He had deliberately made the marionette say such words, as it matched Admiral of Blood's persona of a boorish pirate. Trissy indiscernibly frowned and said, Is there anything else? Senor didn't continue on the topic as he said, You look like you've almost recovered. Trissy smiled. Not bad. I'll be leaving tomorrow. She paused as she slightly narrowed her slender eyes. To be frank, I doubt whether you're the real Admiral of Blood at times. Of course it's real. You should ask if he's alive or dead. With his interest piqued, Klein made Senor ask, Why do you say that? Trissy's gaze swept over the wraith's face and said, It's said that Admiral of Blood is someone who indulges in his desires, and he has no resistance towards beautiful females and males. Yet, I don't see any sparks of desire when you face me. I believe the real Admiral of Blood would have added the condition of doing something I wouldn't want to in the agreement. Klein deliberated for 2 seconds and made Senor give a self-deprecating smile. I'm afraid of finding myself lost to pleasure and ending up being controlled by you. Trissy's expression instantly changed. This was indeed one of the reasons why she had raised the topic. To a demoness of pleasure, beyonders who habitually indulged in their desires were natural prey. Klein actively ignored the topic and made the marionette say, You're seeking out the target tomorrow? Very clearly, the Royal Guard captain knows you and knows what you look like. After all, you were arranged by them to be by Prince Edisac's side. Klein silently added. Trissy lowered her head and looked at her toes before chuckling. Rest at ease, I have the perfect plan. As she spoke, she turned her body sideways and casually looked deep into the sewers. If you set off from here, at the end of the 6th left fork is a hidden passage. It has signs of prolonged human activity. Heh, I discovered it while walking around in the past few days. I believe it has something to do with that girl, right? It's also the reason why you're here. Hidden passage? Klein didn't confirm or deny it. He made Senor smile and say, Did you discover anything? Trissy shook her head. There was nothing at all. Perhaps only a certain pathway, or someone with a specific item, can find the clues. A marauder's intuition, or something on Hazel's person? Klein didn't make Senor continue on the topic as he pressed his hand to his chest and bowed with a smile. Since you've recovered, I can be at ease. The moment he said that, he suddenly vanished. Trissy focused her eyes into a stare, but it was to no avail. Only when the invisible thread she had released was hit by a breeze did she retract her gaze, confirming that Admiral of Blood had really left. At that moment, Klein had brought the wraith back to the manhole without attempting to explore the spot which Trissy had mentioned. There were 3 reasons for his decision. First, it had exceeded 100 meters. Second, he suspected that he wouldn't find anything since he wasn't from the marauder pathway, nor did he have the corresponding items. Third, Trissy was still around. Furs woke up naturally on a Sunday morning as she got up to wash up. As she chewed on a fresh piece of toast, she retrieved a stack of items from her mailbox. As she walked to the coffee table with a cup of coffee on it, she casually flipped through the items and discovered a reply letter she had been looking forward to. Throwing down the papers, bills, and other letters, Furs tore open the envelope. Teacher is already in Backlund? Furs quickly read through the letter as she muttered in surprise. At the same time, she saw the toast in her mouth plunge to the ground. Chapter 786, Accounting Fraud Hat Trick in on Sherwood Burrows 22 Hope Street. Just as the attendant at the front desk was about to drink some water, she saw a lady walk in. The lady was about 1.65 meters tall, and she wore a light-colored dress with frilly sides. Her brown curly hair cascaded down as she wore colored glasses. She looked casual, just like someone who had just returned from Desi Bay. She held a dark brown leather suitcase as she unhurriedly walked to the front desk. A lady with extraordinary disposition. Her attire is nice. How I wish I could see what she looks like without her glasses. As a female, the attendant habitually sized up her clothes and accessories. She then heard the lady say in a languid tone, 1 night. A single room. 2 soldi and 8 pence. The attendant gave her the room rate for the day and directly asked, "Do you have any identification documents?" She wasn't too adamant about registering her identity, because the inn had no means of confirming the authenticity of the documents. Yes. The lady put down her dark brown suitcase and took out an identification document from her handbag before passing it to her. Margaret Taylor, the attendant muttered as she registered her before finding a bunch of keys. Room 2012. Thank you. The lady in fashionable attire received the keys, carried the dark brown suitcase, and walked towards the staircase. At this moment, an attendant in a red vest came over. He bowed and asked, "How may I help you?" He immediately cast his gaze on the dark brown suitcase. The lady curled her lips into a smile as she shook her head. "There's no need. It's very light." With that said, she didn't stop as she walked up the stairs and entered room 2012. Only after she closed the door and put down the suitcase did she raise her right hand to her chest, letting out a long sigh of relief. Why do I feel like a psychotic murderer? She was none other than the disguised Furs. There was nothing in her suitcase except for Mr. X's head, which was wrapped in newspapers. The 2 attendants from before probably wouldn't have guessed that a fashionable lady didn't have any clothes, facial products, or makeup in her suitcase, but a cracked, bloody head. If they were to discover that, everyone in the inn would be given a fright. This is source material for a detective novel. Furs calmed her feelings of anxiousness and picked up her suitcase again and opened the door. She observed the corridor and saw no one walking through it. She hurriedly walked out and headed for room 2016 and rapped on the wooden door. Her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham, was living in the same room he previously used. After sensing someone sizing her up through the peephole, Furs heard the doorknob twist as the gears unlocked. Dorian Gray was dressed in a black suit with very broad shoulders. He looked to the left and right warily before making way, allowing his student to enter. "No one noticed you, right?" Following that, he closed the door and asked cautiously. Furs put down the suitcase and removed the colored glasses that hid half her face. "No, I used a fake identity. As a Beyonder in Backland with rather rich experience as a low-sequence Beyonder, having a few fake identification documents was necessary. Furthermore, she had Zio's expert help in such matters. The only problem was that it was ultimately a fake identity that couldn't stand up to police scrutiny. However, Furs had heard that there were places where real identity documentation could be obtained. Furthermore, they were documents which the police department had a record of, with the pictures swapped. Of course, the price was much more expensive. Dorian nodded gently and silently exhaled. As he got Furs to sit, he brought a chair over and said, "You mentioned that someone is paying to find the direct descendants of the Abraham family at a Beyonder gathering in Backland? And the goal is to find information on Mr. Dorr?" "Yes, teacher," Furs said nothing but the truth. "I don't know much about the family, so I thought of asking you to see if you knew anything." She hid 2 points, namely the Beyonder gathering being called the Tarot Gathering, and that she long knew that her teacher was a member of the Abraham family. Dorian sat down and drank a sip from a white porcelain teacup. He asked with a calm expression, "Who was the one asking?" "I'm not sure. I can only confirm that it was a woman. She had concealed her appearance. She seemed very powerful and must have quite a strong backing." Furs described her impression of Ma'am Hermit. What she didn't say was that this woman had close ties with Queen Mystic Bernadette. Dorian Gray pondered for a few seconds before saying, "I don't know much either. All I know is that Mr. Dorr is the ancestor of the Abraham family. He vanished during the War of the 4 Emperors. You can try using this piece of information to get some of the bounty." "Mr. Dorr is the Abraham family's ancestor?" "Mr. Dorr, who made the Abraham family suffer the curse of the full moon, causing many members to lose control, is actually the Abraham family's ancestor?" Furs was alarmed. Having already learned some of the problems of the Abraham family from Mr. Fool, she couldn't believe that the cause of all of this was the source of the bloodline. Does Mr. Dorr not know the consequences of his actions? Furs muttered silently as she couldn't help but frown. Dorian Gray noticed his student's abnormal reaction as he asked, somewhat puzzled, "Is there a problem?" "Oh no, I didn't manage to hide my expression." Furs deliberated and said, "I just don't understand. It's been more than 1,000 years, so apart from the Abraham family's direct descendants, who would wish to gather information on Mr. Dorr and why? Perhaps they're trying to find Mr. Dorr." "Ah, right, Queen Mystic is Emperor Roselle's daughter, and Mr. Dorr has appeared in Emperor Roselle's diary. Therefore, the Queen is trying to find Mr. Dorr to figure out the truth of the past. That's normal. However, Mr. Dorr vanished in the War of the Four Emperors, more than 1,000 years before Emperor Roselle's era. How did they manage to contact each other? Could it be that Emperor Roselle could also hear the full moon ravings? I remember Mr. Dorr making a remark that Mr. Dorr might be calling for help. If that's the case, it's really. As an author, Furs was momentarily at a loss for words to describe her feelings. Dorian revealed a wry smile and said, "Certainly, I'm also puzzled about this problem. Remember to tell me if you find the answer." Furs didn't harp on this matter, afraid that Dorian Gray would notice anything amiss. She then said, "Teacher, why did you suddenly come to Backlund?" Dorian smiled and picked up a cigarette as he raised it to his nose to give it a whiff. Without lighting it, he said, "I happen to have some matters that need me to be in Backlund. I also decided to check on your digestion progress." In fact, he had been alarmed by Furs's letter. He couldn't believe that anyone in the world would still be asking about Mr. Dorr. One had to know that even the Abraham family had given up such attempts. He was the only one who kept at it, teaching students on his own accord. This also made him recall a prophecy that was passed around within the family: the Abrahams were increasingly approaching their destruction. When he connected the two matters together, he rushed over to Backlund to confirm his student's situation. He wished that she could advance as soon as possible, leaving some hope for the Abraham family. "I just grasped the various astrological knowledge," Furs replied, feeling a little guilty. Due to her lack of money, she hadn't bought the high-quality crystal ball needed by an astrologer. To not continue on this topic, Furs began asking Dorian Gray about the acting principles needed for astrologer, obtaining advice such as, "Astrology isn't all-powerful." Towards the end, Furs glanced at the dark brown suitcase beside her and said, "Teacher, there's one more matter." "What is it?" Dorian leaned back into his chair as he leisurely drank a mouthful of black tea. Furs followed the script she had prepared and said, "After knowing that Louis Veen betrayed the organization, inflicting a great deal of harm upon all of you, I've always had the thought of finding him and exacting revenge for all of you." "Give up that thought." Dorian sat up straight. "Even if you have Lamino's travels, you are no match for him, much less able to kill him. I'm very glad that you have such thoughts, but there's no need to take unnecessary risks. I'm definitely not able to do it alone." Furs mumbled silently before saying, "I got to know a very powerful bounty hunter. I spent about £10,000 to seek his help." She wasn't able to estimate the cost of the job, so she had used the price that Miss Audrey paid when previously entrusting them to kill the Intis ambassador. That might be a cheat. Louis Veen is likely a traveler, and he has the support of the Aurora Order. Dorian didn't hold any hopes of any bounty hunter being Louis Veen's match when he heard his student say, "He has already succeeded." Cough. 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 Dorian choked on his saliva as he broke out into a fit of coughs. He dropped the teacup to the ground, but it bounced up like magic, firmly landing on the coffee table. "He has given me Louis Veen's head." Furs held up the dark brown suitcase and opened it, taking out the spherical object which was wrapped in newspapers. With the newspapers unfolded bit by bit, Dorian saw that face he would never forget. The smug smile on Louis Veen's face back when he attacked the Abraham family's headquarters was gone. His head was covered in cracks, as though it had been glued together piece by piece. It was gruesome. filled with pain and despair. As an astrologer, Dorian Gray's spiritual intuition told him that it was undoubtedly Louis Vine's head. Good, very good, Dorian muttered in excitement before looking up at his student. Who was the bounty hunter? I can't imagine Backlund having such a powerful bounty hunter. Furs hesitated for a moment before saying, Gehrman Sparrow. Chapter 787, Dorian's warning. Gehrman Sparrow. Dorian felt the vessels on his forehead pulse when he heard that as he held his hands together, tensing up without realizing it. Situated in Pritz Harbor, he inevitably learned of the various news at sea, both actively and passively, knowing far more than the residents in Backlund who relied on the newspapers. In recent months, he often heard from different channels of information about Gehrman Sparrow. From killing Steele Mavady to severely injuring Vice Admiral Aylmer Tracy, to successfully hunting Admiral of Blood Senior, all these stories were colored with mania. He left the sea and came to Backlund? He hasn't changed his trait of craziness. Dorian held back the horror and wariness that subconsciously rose in his heart as he looked at his student and said in a deep voice, It's best that you minimize your communication with that bounty hunter. He's bound to get into big trouble one day, and it wouldn't take long for that to happen. Teacher is indeed experienced and has great acumen. He instantly saw through Mr. World's intrinsic nature. Unfortunately, I'm already a member of the Tarot Club, so it's impossible not to communicate with him. Furs adjusted her state of mind and sincerely nodded. Yes, teacher. Dorian composed himself and once again looked at his former student and current enemy, Louis Vine. However, this traveler could no longer speak. He didn't even have an iota of spirituality left. After a few seconds of silence, Dorian leaned back slightly and looked at Furs. You mentioned paying £10,000 for the job. He wasn't aware of Furs's financial situation, other than knowing that his student was a best-selling author who likely earned quite a bit from her royalties. Furthermore, she seemed to be doing quite well in the few Beyonder circles with transactions that rewarded handsomely. Therefore, it wasn't too surprising or unacceptable that she could save up £10,000. Furs fidgeted, feeling a slight guilty conscience as she said, Is it too expensive? She deliberately asked a question in order to hide the fact that she had mentioned a fake number, so as to show that she didn't have much experience in such matters. Dorian shook his head. No, it's too cheap. It's so cheap that I suspect whether Gehrman Sparrow has other motives. As a member of the Abraham family which had suffered numerous setbacks, he often maintained a relatively high level of wariness. In the professional terminology of various clubs and gatherings, that's called a membership fee. Furs lampooned as she frankly said, there were other conditions, including everything on Louis Vine's person belonging to him, as well as the requirement of me providing him help. Also, I promised that if he's in need of cash in the future, I will compensate him an additional £3,000. That's reasonable, but just barely. Dorian nodded gently and said, Usually, assassinating Louis Vine, who had the Aurora Order backing him, would cost at least £30,000. And if there are other situations, the price will be higher. Back then, Mr. World had used demigod powers recorded in Lamino's travels. He probably encountered something else. An Aurora Order saint? Having had an edifying experience exerted on her by the Tarot Club, Furs wasn't unfamiliar with the Aurora Order structure. She didn't hide her frown as she said, From the looks of it, it's indeed a little abnormal. Perhaps he's in desperate need of cash. Dorian thought and said, Perhaps he cares more about Louis Vine's Beyonder characteristic. To the Beyonders of other pathways, it can be forged into a rather useful mystical item as long as he finds a suitable artisan. Dorian paused for 2 seconds before adding, There's no need to worry about that. Just stay away from him in the future. Perhaps he had long targeted Louis Vine, and he was just using the information you provided to carry out the assassination while still getting an additional bonus. Dorian didn't continue on the topic as he took out a fist-sized pure crystal ball from his pocket. It's made of star crystal, and it can effectively raise your astromancy. The light shone in from outside the window as resplendent waves surfaced within the crystal ball. Without waiting for Furs to reject, Dorian chuckled. Louis Vine is my enemy. The payment used to get rid of him should be paid by me. I don't have that much cash at the moment, and I can only use some items to deduct from the payment. No, there's no need. Furs shook her head, partially genuine, but partially in contradiction to her will. It was genuine because she only wanted to seek revenge for her teacher back when she thought of getting rid of Louis Veen without considering the possible reward she could later receive. It was in contradiction to her will because she couldn't reject the reward. Dorian said with a stern expression, "Do you wish for me to be ashamed and uneasy? Don't worry. I still have quite a bit of wealth." Furs nodded in response. "All right then," Dorian smiled once again. "Also, I've brought you the scribe potion formula. You can gather the corresponding ingredients as you digest the astrologer potion." "Heh, I'll prepare one of the main ingredients for you, the brain of an Asman. You'll have to rely on yourself for the rest." An Asman was said to be a monster that existed in ancient times. It looked like an unprotected human brain that could fill a room. Not only could it create terrifying illusions, but it could also make its attackers die from their own attacks. As he spoke, Dorian took out a yellowish-brown goatskin and passed it to Furs. Furs received it in gratitude and quickly scanned the list of main ingredients. One complete brain of an Asman, cursed artifact of an ancient wraith. I hope I can gather the remaining ingredients before I finish digesting the astrologer potion. Just as Furs rolled up the goatskin, she saw Dorian take out a pure golden box from his suitcase. After removing the wall of spirituality, Dorian opened the box as he said, "Without the gold enclosing it, the brain of an Asman will constantly affect you, causing you to hallucinate until you lose your mental facilities." Inside the squarish box was a blob of grayish-white, translucent, and wrinkled object. It was about a fifth the size of Louis Veen's head. As expected of a family with a long history. Furs sincerely thanked him once again and received the golden box and skillfully closed it and used a wall of spirituality to seal it. Dorian didn't stop and instead gave an excuse for Furs to stay back. He set up a ritual and summoned the void creature Malmouth, who enjoyed music. He then took out 2 documents from the creature's spherical body. He had prepared the 3 items for Furs when he received the shocking news regarding Mr. Dorr, therefore, he had it on him. These are 2 pieces of property in Backlund. One of them is in Hillston Borough, and the other is in Sherwood Borough. They're in excellent locations and should have a total valuation of about £6,500. The amount you can sell them for will be yours, Dorian said with a smile. Although the Abraham family was in a state of decline, as a former angel family with a long history, it still had quite a bit of resources, including land, tree farms, property, manors, and mines. However, Dorian only had control over a few, with most of the remainder belonging to the various smaller families. "The place I'm renting costs £2,500 and s in an okay district but an average location. What teacher gave me today does add up to about £10,000. Furs couldn't help but sigh inwardly. In the Holy Wind Cathedral, Deep Blue officiant Randall Valentinus looked at the mandated Punisher deacon and said, "Any findings?" The new Backlund archbishop was a middle-aged man with a domineering demeanor. His dark blue hair was thick, and he had large earlobes. His eyes seemed to constantly hide lightning and storms within them. The mandated Punisher deacon standing before his desk was a thin middle-aged man wearing a modified captain's hat. His looks didn't stand out, but there was an anchor tattoo on his neck. The man answered reverently, "Your Eminence, we've already caught some of the members who participated in the gathering. However, they have no idea who the rest are, much less know of the person who assassinated Mr. X. According to their description, the assailant was about 1.6 meters tall and likely female. We can't rule out the possibility that it's a short man." Randall held back his anger and asked, "What do you plan on doing next?" "As we are temporarily unable to know who Mr. X invited to the gathering, and 1.6-meter tall women are common, our plan is to relax our stance on the surface as we target a few suspicious targets and convert those we've caught into informants. Without us exerting any danger, those bunch of lunatics from the Aurora Order will definitely seek out the murderer themselves in order to avenge Mr. X. They'll likely do a carpet search, and this way, not only will we find the assassin, but we can also discover more clues to the Aurora Order, the thin middle-aged man explained in detail. Randall nodded in thought and said, Roy, when taking action, remember to apply for a Grade 1 sealed artifact. The situation is clear that the Aurora Order has at least a saint in Backland. And the assassin's strength is greater than the typical Sequence 5 Beyonder, and they similarly have a demigod backing them. Yes, Your Eminence. Roy Wellesley struck the left side of his chest with his right fist. Dwayne, you often exceed my expectations. It hasn't taken you long to finish studying the revelation of Evernight's Book of Wisdom. Inside St. Samuel Cathedral, Bishop Electra closed the Bible in his hands and smiled at the pious tycoon with gray sideburns and deep blue eyes. Klein laughed and replied, This is expected of a believer. Next up is the study of the letters of the saints? Yes, which saint do you wish to begin with? Electra asked. Klein looked to his sides and chuckled. Let's do St. Samuel then. Electra wasn't surprised at that as he seriously introduced, St. Samuel was a Backland archbishop during the fourth epoch of the Trunsoist Empire. He contributed greatly to the spreading of the goddess's faith and entered her divine kingdom before dying, becoming an angel. As he spoke, he flipped to the corresponding letters of the saints. At this moment, Klein's spiritual perception was triggered. He felt a deep sense of evil and diabolical will spread above him. Following that, a cold and quiet feeling extended from underground, leveling everything and restoring the cathedral to its former tranquility. Bishop Electra snapped out of his daze and said to Dwayne Dantes, who didn't seem to detect anything, Sorry, I just recalled something. Chapter 788, Hidden Passage, It's fine, Klein replied with a warm smile. Although he didn't seem to notice anything, thoughts were flying through his mind. He began considering what the anomaly that happened during that instant meant. Previously, the keepers would head upstairs along the nearby staircase. It can be preliminary determined that they live there, coinciding with the area where the anomaly happened. The keepers aren't in the best of conditions, so the chances of them losing control are greater than ordinary Beyonders, causing them to suddenly release a sense of an evil and diabolical will. And this was suppressed and quelled by the core seal deep behind Cheney's gate? If that's the case, there are two possibilities. 1. The core seal behind Cheney's gate can sense all the anomalies in St. Samuel Cathedral, and then react instinctively. 2nd, during the keeper's watch over the years, they are constantly corroded by the core seal's powers. In a certain sense, they are a part of it, or they bear the weight of the corresponding traits. Once any abnormalities happen, their bodies will immediately intervene. If it's the former, that means that when I knock a keeper unconscious and replace him, it will easily be detected by the core seal behind Cheney's gate. It will produce an anomaly like before, causing my plan to fail right at the beginning. If it's the latter, I'll definitely be repelled when entering Cheney's gate, even when disguised as a keeper. I need to figure out the problem before coming up with a direct countermeasure. It's really difficult to steal sealed artifacts from the various churches. It's no wonder almost no one is willing to do so. As Klein's thoughts wandered, he superficially paid attention to Bishop Electra's explanation of St. Samuel's experiences and letters that he left behind. When it was almost time, he politely bade him farewell. After returning to 160 Buckland Street, he saw his butler approach just as he handed his hat and cane to Richardson. Sir, do you plan on holding a ball or banquet next weekend and invite the neighbors? Walter wasn't using a suggestive tone, but a tone of inquiry. However, Klein knew very well that since his butler had raised the matter, it meant that it was almost time. He nodded gently and said, Saturday night then. A ball. I'll have to trouble you and Tanaja to make the preparations. Is there enough money? When saying the last statement, Klein looked to his housekeeper. Tanaja sternly nodded and said, There's enough. The various alcoholic beverages in your wine cellar is enough to handle several banquets. When moving into 160 Buckland Street, Klein had handed her £1,000 in cash for the household expenses. From the looks of it, even with the need to replenish fine wine, tea leaves, and coffee beans, it wasn't something that could be spent in a month. The gold pound is rather strong after all. Klein nodded and smiled. Let's not use wine that's too expensive for our first ball. It's common to be reserved in loan. Yes, sir. Although Walter was very aware of how to run a ball, he still paid serious attention to his employer's instructions. He paused and said, "There are only 2 things you need to do. First, it's to settle the guest list with our help, thinking up some small talk for each guest, matching the person's corresponding status and experience. Second, it's to order a suit for the ball." How troublesome. When greeting Hazel, can I say that the sewers here are cleaner than the squares in the southern continent? As Klein sighed and lampooned, he nodded slightly. No problem. Deep into the night, the crimson moon hung high in the sky. The smog which had significantly thinned made Backlund have an additional sense of tranquility. In Dwayne Dantes' master bedroom, Klein set up a ritual to summon himself. He planned on entering the sewers tonight to confirm that Trissy had left. He then planned on heading for the fork she had described, to explore the so-called hidden passageway to see if he could discover anything. Klein didn't have extravagant hopes of gaining anything. He was only worried that the secret hidden in the sewers would pose a hidden risk that would one day explode. This could easily involve Dwayne Dantes, who lived nearby, spoiling his plans in stealing the Antigonus family's notebook. On this matter, I can't be an ostrich that buries its head in the sand and pretend not to know anything. I should discover the problem early and destroy what needs destroying or report what needs reporting before it completely erupts. That's the most effective solution. Of course, I also need to be sufficiently careful. I mustn't let my exploration end up lighting a fuse. Klein's spirit body tore out of the candlelight, and with Azek's copper whistle augmenting him, he possessed the physical body of Dwayne Dantes, controlling him to walk to the boundary of the wall of spirituality and sit in the reclining chair. To the external world, it looked as though the tycoon had dozed off reading the papers. Summoning my soul to possess my own body feels different from returning to my body. There's an obvious barrier in between. Klein did a comparison of the experience and floated to his desk, cleaning up most of the items on the altar and leaving behind the candle that maintained his summoning to burn silently. After doing all of this, Klein wore creeping hunger, and with Azek's copper whistle, death knell, and the seigneur gold coin in possession, he flew out of the master bedroom and left 160 Backlund Street, drilling into the sewers. Just as Klein found himself in the moist and dirty environment, he immediately released Wraith Seigneur and made his marionette open up a distance from him, turning into the hidden fork where Trissy was previously recuperating. This time, he saw that the clean region in the sewers was already stained with dirt containing signs of rats. From the looks of it, Trissy has really left. Klein, who was following far behind, heaved a sigh of relief. As a spirit body, he didn't need to breathe, nor did he need to walk on the ground. Therefore, he didn't mind how disgusting the sewers were. Seigneur walked out of the area and continued walking ahead and turned on the 6th left turn. Klein constantly maintained a distance of 50 meters, perfectly acting the role of the person behind the scenes. At the end of the fork was a corroded wall covered in moss. At a glance, there weren't any abnormalities to it. If Trissy hadn't mentioned it, Klein wouldn't have gotten his marionette to observe every inch of the area in detail. A few minutes later, Seigneur suddenly straightened his back and walked forward, entering the wall. Passing through the rather thick obstacle, Klein's eyes opened up. With the marionette's vision, he saw a half-natural, half-artificial cave. It wasn't more than 1.8 meters high and was about 3 meters wide. The ground was littered with tools like shovels which were wrapped in oilskin and large piles of mud and rubble. Right up ahead were 2 hidden passageways that extended downwards. The left one was about 5 to 6 meters deep, while the one on the right was nearly 10 meters deep. However, nothing seemed to have existed in them, as though they were still being excavated. This was dug up by Hazel. In the day, she's an arrogant lady of high society, and at night, she's an excavator in the sewers? Furthermore, she's moving the dirt and rubble one pail at a time. She was loitering around to find the exact spot, and digging was the subsequent step. That wall must have been a secret door. Klein hid himself at the fork's entrance as he made Seigneur scrutinize the area. Following that, he made the wraith enter the left passage until he reached a completely sealed-off area. Señor's figure slowly turned faint as it turned incorporeal. In this state, he passed through the soil and explored deeper. But even when reaching the 100-meter limit, he didn't discover anything of use. All he saw were ordinary insects and worms. Klein made the marionette switch directions, swimming in the sea of soil without finding anything. Señor soon returned to the cave from before and entered the right passageway without being affected by any obstacles. There's still nothing. It's not without reason that Trissy determined that it will only work for a particular pathway or being in possession of a certain item. She must have probed the area with the invisible threads of a demoness of pleasure. Unfortunately, I've already lost Tinder. I wonder if the gray fog's aura on me would work. It seems to strongly attract beyonders from the Marauder pathway. Klein silently commented and, using his spirit body state, planned on personally visiting the 2 hidden passageways that Hazel had dug up. However, he curbed his desire because he was now a marionettist. Doing it personally in situations that didn't require it was in violation of the acting principles. It's fine even if I don't use the gray fog's aura. I'll just request to purchase a mystical item from the Marauder pathway during tomorrow afternoon's tarot gathering. It doesn't need to be too expensive. It can just correspond to sequence 8 or 9. That badge from Lenivis is only a signal receiver, not an item of this pathway. While not aware of the exact situation of what's hiding inside, rashly using my spirit body to explore it might result in me attracting a high-sequence monster. Being careful and cautious will forever be a condition for myself. Klein slowly heaved a sigh of relief and retrieved Wraith Señor. He wasn't worried that Hazel would continue coming in the near future. Any person with normal intelligence wouldn't continue coming unless they had the means to deal with the situation from before. Ignoring how Hazel hasn't had any contact with Beyonder circles, even if she has, getting an item from the Sun domain isn't simple. After all, Backland is the territory of the Church of Storms. I do have something that I don't use often. Heh, can I find an opportunity to sell it to her and then let her use it to harm my marionette? Klein jeered at himself before shaking his head with a laugh. He ended the summoning and returned above the gray fog, vanishing from the sewers. On Monday morning, the bright sunlight tore through the thin clouds, shining onto every corner of Backland. Emlyn White pulled down on his silk top hat. As he left the carriage and walked to the Harvest Church, he squinted his eyes and mumbled, "What terrible weather. Backland's worst season is coming soon." He was just about to step onto the stairs when he saw a paperboy approach him, handing him a copy of the Tussock Times. "Sir, today's morning papers." Emlyn wanted to reject it when he discovered a small slip clasped in the middle of the boy's fingers. Emlyn maintained his countenance as he took out a penny and passed it to the boy, receiving the copy of the Tussock Times and the slip. Before entering the Harvest Church, he quickly spread it open and scanned it. "There are clues to the people you are looking for. Please come to the Bravehearts Bar." Chapter 789, Each Person's Monday 9:30 a.m. Backland Bridge Area, Iron Gate Street, Bravehearts Bar. Emlyn White stood rooted to his spot after he got down from the carriage. He stared ahead in a daze, nearly forgetting to avoid the sunlight. At that moment, the bar's main door was shut with no signs of it opening. As a sanguine who seldom left his home and only went to places like bars at night, Emlyn never expected the bar to be closed in the morning. He had left the Harvest Church in a rush via the transportation system after seeing the paper slip, hoping to obtain any first-hand intelligence. To save time, he even tolerated the cramped environment and stench of the metro. At that moment, Emlyn was somewhat peeved, but he knew that he had made the mistake. All he could do was pull a face and circle around Iron Gate Street to not waste his trip. Just as he was about to approach a rental carriage that stood along the street, he caught sight of a familiar figure from the corner of his eye. The person was wearing a brown rounded top hat and an old coat while carrying a ragged haversack. He was none other than Ian, the underground arms dealer and intelligence merchant. I have quite good intuition. I knew he would appear early. Emlyn was delighted as he stuffed his hands into his pockets and leisurely walked over, blocking Ian's way as he chuckled. "Good morning." Ian looked up and glanced at the handsome man before him, replying in puzzlement, "Good morning, Mr. White. You should have come in the evening." "It seems to be a suitable time now," Emlyn said with a smile, clearly in a good mood. "Ian, why do you always wear the same clothes and outfit every time I see you?" Ian answered without minding the question, "This can make me appear more mature while allowing me to keep a low profile. Of course, the main reason is that I lack money." The final sentence was added with a joking tone. "I look forward to your attire in summer," Emlyn said with a scoff. "I'll take off my coat." As Ian spoke, he took out 2 pieces of paper from his ragged haversack. They were the bounty notices that Emlyn had previously given him. Someone in Eastborough saw this person. He handed over one of the papers to Emlyn, and on it was the name, Argos. Realizing that there really were clues to the primordial moon believers, Emlyn asked in delight, "Where is he?" Ian didn't reply as he looked at him with a silent smile. Experienced, Emlyn immediately took out his wallet and gave £150 to Ian. "That's your reward." Ian smiled and said, "There's still another half to go." "Another half?" Emlyn nearly wanted to let this merchant in front of him know the prowess of a sanguine. This was because an effective clue cost £20, while an exact location cost £150. However, he quickly read between the lines as he asked in pleasant surprise, "Another one was found?" "Yes." Ian handed him the remaining piece of paper in his hand. "While my friend observed Argos and confirmed his residence, it was discovered that he had met with this person named Gallus Kevin. Therefore, I've obtained the residence of the 2 targets at the same time." "Very good." Emlyn emptied his wallet and gave another £150 to Ian. He was abnormally delighted. He felt that the ancestor and Mr. Fool were blessing him. This was because there were only 5 targets, and he had successfully hunted one. Now, with 2 additional clues, all he needed to do was succeed in order to declare himself victor regardless of what the other sanguine did. Ian seriously counted and checked the notes before saying with a suppressed voice, "Argos is on the 3rd story of the apartment block at Eastborough's 6 Limestone Street, opposite the public washroom. Gallus Kevin is similarly in Eastborough. He stays in the room beside the staircase on the 1st floor at 19 Beluga Whale Street. I will confirm your intelligence. I believe you wouldn't wish to abandon your business for a mere £300. Emlyn nodded gently as he gave a warning. Following that, he chuckled and said, "They were found so easily?" Ian's red eyes darted around slightly as he said, "First, many bounty hunters are my friends. They have many informants in Eastborough. Second, those 2 gentlemen didn't have great disguises. Despite being in Eastborough, they wore very different attire from the people around them. If they were willing to wear more ragged clothes and did more than 12 hours of labor work, I believe they would be hard to find in the messy Eastborough." "Is that so?" "One needs to take note of the difference in environment when hiding oneself." Emlyn muttered silently to himself, feeling as though he had learned a new trick. He didn't plan on heading to Eastborough immediately. This was because even if he took action in the day, it would be very difficult to escape without causing a commotion. It was a rather dangerous act in Backland, as it meant that the mandated punishers or nighthawks might come knocking at the door just after he sneaked back home. Emlyn planned on verifying the situation and taking action between 8 to 9 in the evening after the tarot gathering. The primordial moon believer from before was quite strong. These 2 likely aren't weaker. Although I have confidence, it feels unsafe only relying on myself. As Emlyn considered the problem, he waved his hand and bade Ian farewell. He rode on a rental carriage, heading back for the south side of the bridge. Eastchester County, Stone City. Audrey stood behind a railing, watching the servants placing the items that had been brought from the family castle in suitable spots. The scene was bustling but orderly. "I'll send someone to associate Professor Michel later and tell him that I'll be paying a visit to the Relic Search and Preservation Foundation. I hope that they've obtained some items that have been tainted with beyonder effects." As Audrey's mind wandered, she couldn't help but smile. She was proud of her decision of donating the funds to establish the foundation. When her eyes that were as beautiful as emeralds saw the time on the wall clock, she hurriedly reined in her thoughts and turned to return to her bedroom. Susie was slumped in a corner of the bedroom. Its front paws were crossed, giving it a sense of elegance. In front of it was an opened book. There were dense lines of text written on it. Susie would raise one of her front paws from time to flip the page as she read with great seriousness. Every time I see Susie like that, I feel a little ashamed. Audrey, you mustn't slack off on your education. Audrey encouraged herself in silence as she approached, planning to get Susie to head outside to guard the door. Susie looked up and glanced at Audrey before standing straight up, saying, "I got it." After saying that, it briskly ran out the bedroom without closing the door. "I haven't said anything." Audrey blinked as she softly muttered to herself. She had given such instructions many times. To prevent Susie from detecting that she wanted to be alone in the room from 3 to 3:30 p.m. on Mondays, forbidding humans and dogs from coming close, she had also done similar matters at other times, pretending that there was a gathering, wanting alone time while maintaining an irregular pattern. I have to say that Susie's existence has effectively raised my motivation to learn, as well as how strictly I handle matters. I can't be inferior to a dog. But being better than this dog doesn't seem to be something worthy of praise. Audrey puffed her cheeks with a self-deprecating comment as she sat by her bed, awaiting the beginning of the tarot gathering. 3 p.m., above the gray fog. Dark red figures shot up along the two sides of the long bronze table, materializing into different blurry figures. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool," Audrey's greeted with a cheery voice as she bowed. The other members greeted one after another until the existence at the seat of honor nodded in response. While sitting down, Furs couldn't help but look at Mr. World, wondering what she should use as an opening. Apart from passing on her teacher's reply to Ma'am Hermit, she planned on doing a few matters. 1. She wanted to tell Mr. World that due to the difficulty of the mission, she would pay him more, but it required him to wait. This was because the sale of the houses took time. Second, after brainstorming, she thought of a good way that could earn money and raise her strength. She had gained inspiration from the world's actions: rent out Lamino's travels. When a member needed an item to temporarily raise their combat strength to deal with certain situations, they could rent Lamino's travels from her. The rent could be paid in two forms: cash, which wasn't too expensive, or to record beyond her powers instead. This also meant that the renter had to guarantee that the spellbook was returned with more filled pages. Of course, as the provider, Furs would record useful apprentice powers like door opening, providing the renter with relevant help. A problem that could easily happen in this transaction was that the renter might not return it, but with Mr. Fool witnessing these exchanges in the Tarot Club, Furs believed that no one would be blinded by greed. And the death of the renter was a low probability event for losing Lamino's travels. But with everyone knowing that they could pray to Mr. Fool in times of danger, death was an even smaller probability. How can there not be any risks when doing business? I will talk to Mr. World about when he will use it so that there won't be any conflicts. Furs retracted her gaze and heard Ma'am Hermit speak. Honorable Mr. Fool, I have 2 pages of Roselle's diary this time. Ever since contact was made with Queen Mystic, the receiving of diary pages has stabilized in a rather terrifying manner. Klein nodded slightly and chuckled. Very good. After a brief silence, Catlia conjured 2 yellowish-brown pieces of paper. They leaped into Mr. Fool's palms as if they had tunneled through the spirit world. Klein slowly lowered his gaze at the diary in his hands. December 29th. It's almost a new year again. All the mausoleums have been built. What's done cannot be undone. Chapter 790. The end of the diary. All the mausoleums have been built. What's done cannot be undone. Klein looked at the diary page in his hand as his thoughts boiled over as ideas kept emerging and shattering. From his point of view, this diary page of Emperor Roselle nearly proved his previous conjectures. He had chosen to forcefully switch to the Black Emperor pathway in his later years, doing so at the cost of going mad to become a Sequence Zero true god. What drove the emperor to make such a decision? What did he discover that resulted in his agitation, rashness, and loss of composure in the previous diary entry? And compared to back then, his emotions in this diary entry appear calm and composed, but it feels like he is even more extreme. It's hard to imagine what the emperor experienced or encountered in his later years that resulted in him having such an abnormal situation. The madness that angels are embroiled with to begin with, or is it something that had happened to the faith of the believers that kept him anchored, his rationality? If he was normal, shouldn't he hold back a little and strive for certain outcomes before finding an opportunity to devour the hidden sage? Klein instantly thought of many things, but he was unable to find any evidence. And on this page of goatskin, there were only 2 short lines of text, as though it indicated the final diary page of Emperor Rozel's life. The end of the year or the beginning of the new year was the day he was suspected to have perished in the White Maple Palace. An emperor of an era, a transmigrator's last words? Klein sighed silently as he flipped to the goatskin beneath. The diary page didn't have a date, but at the top of the page was a line in Fey Sac, immediately follows the previous page. The words were written neatly and elegantly, very different from Emperor Rozel's handwriting. It was obvious that it was added by someone else. It's probably a note by Queen Mystic. To indicate that this is the last part of the diary, written after the emperor said that what's done cannot be undone. But why isn't there a date? Klein was deeply puzzled as he read the corresponding content, his gaze freezing up. I believe I'm not the only transmigrator in this world. If there's anyone else who can read my diary, remember to carefully select your Beyonder pathway. Once you choose this, it pretty much confirms your allies and your enemies. I'm unable to give any actual suggestions because I myself can't see the true faces of the 7 deities or those evil gods. This might be partially related to the second blasphemy slate that the ancient organization hides. Unfortunately, I only have a rough idea of the hidden parts, and I'm unable to verify them. Similarly, I don't know what's written on the first blasphemy slate either. A useful warning is to not choose pathways with sequence zeros that are occupied, and also be careful of neighboring sequence zeros and sequence ones. I've suffered tremendously on this aspect. As for what sequence 0 represents, search for my other diary pages if you aren't aware. This page is equivalent to the afterword of my life. If I succeed, I'll be a god, and it will be another story. If I were to fail, there wouldn't be a future. Perhaps, well, you know. Go, my friend who understands my diary, go seek out the secret of transmigration and the truth hidden within. I'll be watching you, if I'm still alive. Finally, let me warn you that you have to remember, be careful of the moon. Klein wasn't surprised about there being more than one transmigrator. After all, he had long known of a senior in the form of Emperor Rozel. He was puzzled about the details that the emperor had used to determine that there wasn't only one transmigrator. This was a very important point, as it held great meaning as to whether there were incomparable problems in his bid to return home. This was like an unknown equation. Without enough examples and conditions, there was no way to obtain the correct answer no matter how he tried to solve it. Only with enough equations could he find the correct answer. The emperor should have written his discoveries on this matter in the previous diary entries. Unfortunately, I have no way of knowing where it is in order to do a targeted search and recovery. Klein silently sighed before considering the other contents in that afterword. The hidden contents in the second blasphemy slate which the Twilight Hermit Order showed? Did they deliberately hide the contents, or did they not actually obtain it? The second blasphemy slate was actually split into 2 parts, with the other half landing in the hands of other factions? My pathway has already been determined. It was selected based on the exclamation found in Emperor Rozel's diary. From the Emperor's afterword, I can be a bit assured. The seer pathway doesn't have a sequence 0 because the mad sequence 1 Zeradol is still alive. And according to the law of Beyonder characteristics conservation, this subdivision part can probably be called the law of incompatibility. If there's a sequence 1, there's no sequence 0. I need to be careful of Zeradol, Mr. Door, Blasphemer Amon, and Palez Zoroast, as well as the other sequence ones who exist in these three pathways. What does being careful of the moon mean? Be careful of the primordial moon? That could be said directly. Wait, the Emperor apparently had thoughts of exploring the Crimson Moon before. Could it be that he finally committed himself to do it and discovered something on the moon, which is why he warned other transmigrators to be careful of the moon? The moon has something to do with transmigration? Yes, the Emperor's tone indicates that he still has some contingency plans, and he might not completely perish. He might be watching me. There should also be clues to such matters, and they should also be written in the earlier diary entries. As conclusions and puzzlements flashed through Klein's mind, he finally turned solemn. He made the diary in his hand vanish and looked towards Katlia. Do you have anything you want to ask? Katlia nudged the heavy glasses on her nose and politely bowed her head. Honorable Mr. Fool, I wish to know if Emperor Roselle is still alive. This question snapped the other members of the Tarot Club out of their own thoughts as they looked towards the end of the bronze table in agitation. Although Emperor Roselle being alive wasn't directly related to them, nor would it bring any obvious influence, this topic was enough to stir the thirst hidden deep in the hearts of people regarding rumors and gossip. I thought I would be immune to such matters after advancing to a psychiatrist. Sigh, I'm really curious. Audrey looked at Mr. Fool with bright eyes as she waited for him to give the answer. Only Derek was uninterested in the matter. The reason why he looked at Mr. Fool was solely because everyone else had done so. Indeed, Queen Mystic's questions are basically targeted at the diary pages she provides. Klein didn't feel stumped as he skillfully chuckled. Perhaps. By using the answer, perhaps, he was expressing that Emperor Roselle had the hope of saving himself. As for whether he eventually succeeded or whether there was an accident, it wasn't in the scope of the question that might not have an answer. Perhaps. Mr. Fool is implying that Emperor Roselle might still be alive? Katlia and company felt as though they had heard the greatest secret in the world as they felt a little agitated and excited. However, they could also sense the underlying tone in Mr. Fool's words. Due to the lack of diary entries and with him having just awoken recently, he was unable to determine if Emperor Roselle had seized an opportunity. To determine that would require more clues and evidence in the future. Regardless, Emperor Roselle was likely mentally prepared for the assassination. Without giving Justice, the Hanged Man, and company to think of the related problems, Klein leaned back and said with a calm tone, "That's all from me." Furs hurriedly snapped out of her fantasizing of Roselle's late years as she looked to the end of the bronze table. Honorable Mr. Fool, I wish to communicate privately with the world. It will end quickly. What does she want to communicate with Gehrman Sparrow about? Isn't Mr. X's matter over? Klein thought in puzzlement as he nodded gently. Yes. Following that, he blocked the senses of the other members and controlled the world to chuckle hoarsely. Is there anything else? Furs deliberated for 2 seconds and said, "This is the matter. Mr. X's head allowed me to receive a handsome reward. I believe that I didn't pay enough on this matter to match the difficulty of the mission. Therefore, I wish to compensate you. How much do you wish to receive?" Not bad. You actually want to compensate me without any prompting. Although Miss Magician is a little greedy on gaining petty advantages, she's still an honest person. It's very normal to earn some profit while making a transaction. It's not considered greedy. The pleasantly surprised Klein sighed inwardly in praise as he made the world chuckle. How much can you pay? Furs hesitated for a moment and said, £5,000. She had used the £10,000 price she had informed her teacher, and planned to split it evenly with Mr. World. Furthermore, she needed the recipe, crystal ball, and beyonder ingredient, thus, she planned on selling the 2 properties and give him money directly. And as for the reason why Furs was this generous, it had to do with the mission being harder than she had expected while also paying too low a price. In addition, she was increasingly fearful of the world Gehrman Sparrow. She didn't dare to offend the crazy adventurer and terrifying bounty hunter. The Abraham family gave quite a huge reward. Klein controlled the world to say with a laugh, if you can use large amounts of gold coins in place of notes, you can pay less. It will just depend on how much you can gather. I'll try my best. Although Furs was very puzzled over why Mr. World valued gold coins that much, she didn't dare to ask. He had done the same with Ma'am Hermit's transaction previously. She paused before asking, Mr. World, when would you need to use Laymanos Travels? I plan on renting it out before and after that period in order to earn some money and be under powers. Rent it out? Rent out a mystical item? Klein was taken aback upon hearing that. He never expected Miss Magician to have such business-oriented mind. Chapter 791, New Model. As a youth that came from the internet age on Earth, Klein quickly understood Miss Magician's idea, how she prepared to do it, and what she was relying on. Isn't this sharing economy? With the Tarot Club and the Fool, there's no technological limitation. Miss Magician is usually lazy and doesn't have a strong presence, but I never expected her to have sharp acumen on such matters. It also stems from me requesting to borrow the spellbook. Regardless, to be able to quickly be inspired and set up a business model is pretty good. Klein deliberately made the World Gehrman Sparrow hesitate for a few seconds before saying, I might need it this weekend and next week. He was estimating this based on the time it took Mr. Hanged Man to return from the Abyss Maelstrom to the Roarsted Sea, while also allocating time for him to stabilize his spirituality and replenish his supplies. When the time came, they would join forces to explore the primitive island with many Beyonder creatures. Furs hurriedly nodded. All right, I will make the arrangements to prevent others from using it. As she heaved a sigh of relief, she requested Mr. Fool that he bear witness for the subsequent rental agreements. After obtaining a confirmation from him, she indicated that she was done with the private communication. Following that, she conjured Laymanos Travels and surveyed the table. Everyone, I have here a mystical item. It has a total of 38 pages. Each page can help the user record Beyonder powers they encounter. They will then be able to release it when needed, but it will be slightly weaker than the original power. Each page can be repeatedly recorded. Each record can only be used once. Amongst them, 3 pages can be used to record demigod-level Beyonder powers, but the chances of success are very low. It might not succeed 1 in 10 times. Furs simply explained the traits of Laymanos Travels and its negative effects. It lit up the eyes of Audrey and company. With them no longer being novices in the domain of mysticism or the Beyonder world, it wasn't difficult for them to tell the value of Miss Magician's notebook without her making it explicit to them. At the same time, they viewed it as a demigod-level artifact. It resembles a shepherd and the creeping hunger. They allow the use of the Beyonder powers from other pathways, but there aren't as many negative effects. There's also a chance to record a demigod power. Draw my own blood. Audrey suddenly shrank her hand back in fear as she thought over the matter. As a powerful noble's daughter, she had almost never been injured from a young age. Therefore, she had an extreme fear of pain that remained an unknown to her. Taking the opportunity when Furs paused, she raised her hand slightly and asked, Miss Magician, how much do you wish to sell it for? Audrey believed that her father, Earl Hall, would also be able to recognize the value of Laymanos Travels, so it was certain that she could be reimbursed by him. Therefore, she planned on fully satisfying Furs's requirements. She must be lacking money recently, or else she wouldn't be selling such an important and useful mystical item. While Audrey thought in pity, she considered whether she should offer to buy it at a premium. Damn it. Why can't it be put on sale after I return from the primitive island? Alger had a strong interest in Laymanos Travels, but he wasn't able to produce the money or materials needed to purchase this mystical item. £1,300 was money that an ordinary person might not be able to save up even in 10 to 20 years, but compared to an item at the level of Laymanos Travels, it was nothing. It's worth at least £10,000. If I encounter Beyonders that are backed by powerful factions, it wouldn't be a problem selling it for more than £30,000. Alger swept his glance at Justice, who was inquiring about the price, as well as Catlia, who had nudged her glasses, looking as though she was planning to join the bid. He couldn't help but sigh. He didn't believe that the transaction would fail according to his wishes, having it left unsold before he returned from the primitive island. Miss Justice has money, and the Hermit has Queen Mystic and the Moses Ascetic Order. They don't lack money or resources. Sigh. Alger adjusted his seating posture as he looked across the table with a heavy look. Emlyn and Derek were similarly interested in Lamino's travels, but it was simply interest. They knew that they lacked the ability to provide anything in a fair exchange. When she heard Miss Justice's question, Furs realized that she had forgotten to mention the most crucial point. She hurriedly added, "No, it's not for purchase. I'm only renting it. When you need it, you can rent it for a short period which will be witnessed by Mr. Fool." "Rent? You can do that?" At that moment, everyone except Klein and Derek were surprised. Without a doubt, they knew what a rental transaction was, but they never expected it to be applied to a mystical item, much less have it appear in the Tarot Club. This was apparently very doable. It was relatively useful for every member of the Tarot Club, and it wouldn't cost them much while remaining affordable. Furthermore, Miss Magician could slowly build up quite a sizable fortune by doing so, but in fact, the best result was to record beyond her powers. She could gather different kinds of beyond her powers from various pathways in this way, making it far more efficient than seeking the chance to record it on her own. Alger quickly realized the key to the rental transaction as he was delighted. He asked, "How much is the rental fee?" Lamino's travels corresponds to a sequence 6. It's usually about £5,000, but due to its uniqueness, it costs at least £10,000. Furs had built up quite a bit of experience during her time in the Tarot Club, so after some consideration, she said, "Each rental basically starts at £300. Every additional day is an additional £50. And when returning it, the notebook needs to have 2 additional pages of beyond her powers than when it was rented out. If there's only 1 blank page or no blank pages when it's rented, one just needs to fill up the full book." Having 2 additional pages didn't mean 2 additional powers. That also meant that they could use any of the beyond her powers in Lamino's travels. One just needed to make up for it later. There was no need for it to be of the same type, as pages were all that mattered. £50 a day, £1,500 a month. If it's possible, I can keep renting it. Audrey did a simple count of the costs. Alger was thrilled when he heard that, as he said with an unperturbed look, "I plan on renting it for 2 days, but the exact price needs negotiation. It will be adjusted based on what beyond her powers are recorded in the notebook." He felt more confident towards his exploration of the primitive island. "When do you plan to rent it?" Furs asked, delighted that she had business right away. "I'll be renting it for 2 days sometime between this weekend to next weekend." "The exact time hasn't been determined," Alger replied without any hesitation. Furs immediately frowned as she said apprehensively, "This period of time has already been reserved for Mr. World." "Reserved for the world? When did this happen?" Alger was surprised as he looked at the other end of the long bronze tail. He soon came to a realization that it had been agreed upon during their private communication. Why would they come to such an agreement? Miss Magician doesn't need to have informed him ahead of time. They had other transactions during the private communication. What kind of communications and transactions would they have? Miss Magician had commissioned the assassination of an Aurora Order Oracle. The world had accepted the mission, and one of the traits of the Oracle is the ability to record and use the beyonder powers of others once. This is identical to Lamino's travels. Does this mean that the world has already succeeded? As such, Miss Magician is indebted to him, and she hadn't fully resolved it. Now, she came up with this method to pay off the rest? Alger eliminated the possibilities and finally felt that he had found the truth. Without anyone catching wind of it, the world Gehrman Sparrow had already hunted an Aurora Order Oracle, an oracle suspected to be a Sequence 5. This secretly made Alger feel alarmed because he was about to cooperate with the world soon. Thankfully, there's Mr. Fool bearing witness. As a blessed, Gehrman Sparrow wouldn't violate the agreement he makes in front of a god. Alger consoled himself and retracted his gaze from the world. Meanwhile, Audrey and Katlia had recalled the matter of the Aurora Order Oracle from the transactions involving both Miss Magician and Mr. World, as well as how the Oracle's powers were similar to Lamino's travels. Hence, they believed that the world might have already completed the mission. Renting the spellbook was one of the parts to completing the transaction. Emlyn didn't think about such matters, putting his focus on the unavailability of Lamino's travels this weekend and the following week. In other words, I can borrow it for the next few days? If I have help from this notebook, those two primitive believers wouldn't be able to pose a threat. Emlyn looked around and turned anxious as he leisurely said, "Can I rent it for today and tomorrow?" £400 plus 2 pages of Beyonder powers, Furs directly announced the price. Emlyn nodded gently. Introduce what Beyonder powers are recorded first. If they aren't very useful to me, I wish that the price can be lowered because I'll need to waste time recording powers. Furs flipped through Lamino's travels and began to give a vague introduction. Door opening. Black screen. Tumble. Teleport. Lightning strike. Float. Flight. Wind blades. Why are there so many Beyonder powers in the storm domain? The world has used it before. He recorded the Beyonder powers corresponding to See God from Mr. Fool. When I return to the cathedral, I should find out what recently happened in Backlund. That oracle couldn't have died without a trace. As Alger listened, he began thinking of investigating the matter. Chapter 792, The Fool's Authority. The hermit similarly thought of the world Gehrman Sparrow from hearing the Beyonder powers which were recorded in Lamino's travels. I wonder if I can pay a certain price to get the fool to showcase demigod powers of the storm pathway as well as his domain. This will be better than seeking the help of the Moses ascetic order. That will make them know of my possession of Lamino's travels. I should first write to Her Majesty. Perhaps she will come to the future to showcase her powers. Katlia was increasingly convinced that the spellbook had a value that exceeded its level and was very regretful that Miss Magician was only renting it. After hearing the description, Emlyn heaved a sigh of relief. This was because the Beyonder powers like lightning were very lethal against artificial vampires. Of course, it was the same for Sanguine. Very good. I was still worried about needing to seek the sun's help and passing Lamino's travels to him to get him to showcase purification powers to be recorded. Emlyn instantly became relaxed as he glanced at Derek beside him while saying to Furs, "Deal." £400 with the recording of a few Beyonder powers was nothing compared to the completion of his mission. I can earn money quickly and also obtain Beyonder powers this way. Furs suddenly felt that her future was bright as she hurriedly smiled. All right, I'll get Mr. Fool to transfer it to you after the gathering. Right on the heels of that, she turned to say to Katlia, "Ma'am, the Abraham family's direct descendant has given a reply. Do you wish to communicate privately or have me directly say it out loud?" Katlia thought and said, "Let's do it privately." Soon, the others had their senses blocked as Furs recounted what her teacher said. They don't know much about Mr. Dort either. They only know 2 things, no, 3. First, among their ancestors, there is an existence known as Mr. Dor. Second, this ancestor vanished in the War of the 4 Emperors. They've been struggling to find him. Third, they will hear ravings that can cause a loss of control during the full moon and blood moon. In addition, they temporarily do not wish to make any direct contact. The third point was added by Furs by herself. She wished that Ma'am Hermit and the Queen Mystic behind her could use this to further understand Mr. Dor's matters. This was beneficial in helping the Abraham escape the fate of being cursed. Mr. Dor is the Abraham family's ancestor and he vanished in the War of the 4 Emperors. He would create ravings during full moons? The latter was confirmed by Mr. Fool, so there's nothing suspicious. That is to say that although Mr. Dor has vanished, he still can affect Beyonders of the same bloodline, as well as living beings that use certain items during the full moon and blood moon. This means that he hasn't completely lost his connection with the real world. This is how the Emperor was able to interact with him. Her Majesty once said that there were members of the Abraham family who worked for the Emperor back then. Katlia had some theories as she gently nodded. If there are any questions, I'll get you to pass them on. I'll pay the remaining £650 today. With £650, along with Mr. Moon's £400, I've made a profit of £1,050 today. Together with the £730 from before, as well as the sale of the 2 properties to pay Mr. World, I might still have £1,000 left. My savings are about to exceed £3,000. This way, I'll have the money needed to purchase the other main ingredient for Scribe. I might still have some left over. At that moment, Furs suddenly found herself a little wealthy. This made her consider helping purchase the interrogator Beyonder characteristic for Zio to make up for the risk she had to endure over Mr. X's assassination. After the blocking of senses was lifted, Furs heard the World Gehrman Sparrow speak before she could say a word. I need a mystical item from the Marauder pathway. It can be at sequence 9 or 8. Katlia considered for a moment and said, I can ask around for you. However, items of the Marauder pathway aren't common. There might be a premium involved. No problem. Klein controlled the world to provide the response. He then made his marionette look at the now wealthy Miss Magician. I want to sell an interrogator Beyonder characteristic for only £1,000. Typically, this sequence 7 Beyonder characteristic which could be used as a main ingredient should have been priced around £1,200, but Klein had 2 sets at the moment. Furthermore, considering how he had used Miss Zio's identity to participate in Mr. X's gathering, there was a certain degree of danger he was bringing to her, therefore, he gave a slight discount. It's only £1,000. That's like a sale at a department store. But why does Mr. World know that I want it? He is Mr. Fool's blessed. The interrogator Beyonder characteristic was in his hands, and he is also aware that I can now afford it. Furs was stunned for 2 seconds as she nearly forgot to reply. During this process, Audrey held back the urge to engage in shopping, because she knew that Zio needed the item. £1,000? An interrogator's Beyonder characteristic? Katlia seriously thought over the hidden intent behind the world when she heard Miss Magician say, Deal, I haven't even made my offer. Katlia mumbled inwardly as she maintained her silence. She could tell that the world and the magician had reached a strange level of understanding on this matter, so she didn't interject. Similarly, she also sensed that something good had happened to the hanged man this week. He appeared more spirited than before, appearing more confident. He previously purchased the potion formula and main ingredients to Ocean Songster. He had also asked me where obninsks that do not belong to the Church of Storms can be found. This is likely related to the ritual. He has already advanced? Katlia suddenly felt a sense of danger. As the Admiral of Stars who was famous throughout the 5 seas, she always felt a sense of superiority in the Tarot Club. But in recent times, with the World Gehrman Sparrow showing his ability at hunting pirate admirals, followed by the Hanged Man reaching sequence 5, a sequence 5 that made him adept at sea battles, she felt that she no longer had the right to belittle others. She felt a sense of urgency that hadn't existed in her for a long time. However, I have sequence 4 ahead of me. It's the boundary between spirituality and godhood. It's not that easy to advance. I still don't see any hope despite preparing for years. Katlia sighed inwardly as she looked at the World Gehrman Sparrow and asked, Any chances for the blood of a mythical creature? I've been waiting for you to ask this. The fool Klein smiled while watching the transactions as he controlled the world to hoarsely laugh. That angel got me to ask you what you can give him in exchange for a drop of blood. He emphasizes that it needs to satisfy him. Angel? Mr. World directly contacted an angel? Furthermore, he has convinced the angel to provide a drop of blood. Audrey was first alarmed before her thoughts raced as she turned to look at the seat of honor. She suspected that the world, Mr. Fool's blessed, had contacted an angel that was in service to Mr. Fool. She was like the magician, believing that the world only knew of clues to the location of an angel or its remains. They never expected him to directly converse with an angel. One had to know that the grounded angels were equivalent to the leaders of the 7 churches. Indeed. Alger sighed silently, believing that his guess has been verified. As expected of Mr. Fool's blessed. Katlia held back her surprise and shock as she pondered. May I know what pathway this angel is from? The world surveyed the area and said, monster. Monster, which means it's an angel from the fate pathway. It's no wonder Mr. Fool's honorific name has the words King of Yellow and Black who wields good luck. Audrey, Derek, and company were enlightened, believing that their inferences matched the actual situation and the inherent logic. Their gazes and guesses stirred Klein. He realized a corresponding problem. In the honorific name he fabricated, the description of wielding good luck had successfully been directed towards the mysterious space above the gray fog. Is this related to why the people from the fate pathway can see my uniqueness? Could this be related to why the Snake of Mercury, Wuxia Chronicles, took the initiative to establish friendly ties with me? In my honorific name's 3 lines, the first line is a description of my inherent self, and the second is about the corresponding divine domain. Only the third line involves the authority. Wields good luck. Of course, the Fool itself can also contain a certain amount of authority. Klein suddenly felt that he needed to find an opportunity to communicate with the unborn fetus. However, he suspected that the paper crane would tear at any moment. This was because just erasing the original content was already a rather precarious process. At this moment, Katlia said, "Thanks for your help. I will seriously consider it and give you a response as soon as possible." She planned on consulting Queen Mystic to see if there were any conditions that would entice an angel from the fate pathway. With the conversation between the world and the hermit ending, the transactions came to a formal end. The tarot gathering then proceeded into a period for free communication. Furs thought for a moment and looked at Emlyn. "I'd like to remind you of 2 things. First, be familiar with the powers on each corresponding page. It will be very dangerous if you were to flip to the wrong page and use the wrong power in combat." Emlyn scoffed immediately as he said, "I'm very confident in my intelligence." Furs didn't speak further and switched to mentioning, a serious case involving Beyonders happened in East Borough. The surrounding region is on high alert. If you plan on carrying out any operations, take note of that. Emlyn viewed this piece of information with great importance as he asked, "Are you aware of what happened?" You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.